Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It started with a hairline fracture near the window, thin as a pencil scratch. By the next week, the crack had split wider, branching outward in jagged paths. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old walls shift, but something was off. The cracks weren't random, they were following a pattern. I traced them one night and realized they were shaping something, a face, not just eyes and a mouth, but expression, grief, pain, rage. The more I stared, the more real it looked. One morning, I found dust scattered beneath it, like something had moved behind the wall. The apartment had been perfect when I moved in. High ceilings, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, windows that caught the morning light just right. The rent was reasonable, the landlord distant but polite. I should have asked why the previous tenant left so suddenly, why their security deposit covered the first month's rent, why they left behind a digital camera on the kitchen counter. I kept the camera. It was expensive, professional grade, with a memory card still inside. When I scrolled through the photos, I found hundreds of images of the same wall where my crack now lived. The pictures showed the wall intact, pristine white paint without a single blemish. But in the corner of each frame, barely visible, was a shadow that didn't match any furniture or fixture in the room. The crack grew bolder. What started as a whisper-thin line became a network of fractures that spread across the wall like veins under pale skin. I measured them with a ruler, marking their progress on a notepad. Each morning brought new growth, new branches extending from the original source. The pattern was deliberate, architectural in its precision. I called a contractor. He examined the wall, tapped it with his knuckles, shook his head. The foundation was solid, he said. No water damage, no structural issues. Sometimes walls just crack. He offered to patch and repaint, but I declined. I needed to understand what was happening first. The face became clearer as the cracks deepened. I could see the outline of cheekbones, the hollow of eye sockets, the line where lips would part. It was beautiful and terrible, like a death mask pressed into the plaster. I started photographing it daily, documenting each change, each new detail that emerged from the growing network of fractures. That's when I noticed the dust. Every morning, a fine powder collected on the floor beneath the wall, not construction dust or paint chips, but something else, something that smelled faintly of earth and metal. I swept it up, examined it under a magnifying glass. It looked like sand, but felt different between my fingers. Heavier, more substantial. I began to hear sounds from within the wall, not the typical settling noises of an old building, but something rhythmic, a tapping like fingers drumming against wood. It was strongest in the early morning, just before dawn, when the apartment was still and quiet. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. The tapping would stop whenever I tried to focus on it, resuming only when I pulled away. The camera's memory card revealed more than I initially realized. Scrolling deeper into the archived photos, I found images I hadn't seen before. The same wall, the same angle, but taken at different intervals. The timestamps showed they were captured over months, maybe years. In the earliest photos, the wall was perfect, but as I progressed through the sequence, I could see the first hairline crack appearing, growing, spreading. Someone else had documented this process. Someone else had watched the face form. I found a journal wedged behind the radiator, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was frantic, desperate. Entry after entry describing the same phenomenon I was experiencing. The crack, the face, the dust, the sounds. But the entries went further, deeper into something I hadn't yet encountered. It's trying to tell me something, one entry read. The expression changes. Sometimes it looks sad, sometimes angry, but always desperate, like it's trapped. I started staying awake at night, watching the wall. The face seemed more animated in darkness, its features shifting subtly as shadows moved across its surface. I could swear I saw the mouth move, forming words I couldn't quite understand. I set up the camera on a tripod, recording hours of footage, hoping to capture whatever was happening. The recordings showed nothing unusual, but when I played them back with headphones, I could hear something beneath the ambient noise. A whisper so faint it might have been my imagination. I ran the audio through enhancement software, isolated the frequency, amplified it. A voice, definitely a voice, speaking words I couldn't make out, but with an urgency that made my skin crawl. I began talking to the wall, feeling foolish at first, but growing more confident as the days passed. I asked questions, waited for responses. The tapping would intensify when I spoke, as if acknowledging my presence. Sometimes the dust would fall in patterns that seemed almost like writing. The face continued to evolve. New cracks appeared daily, adding depth and detail to the features. I could see individual teeth now, the texture of skin, even what looked like hair. It was becoming more human, more real, more present. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. The wall commanded too much attention, drew me to it like a magnet. I found myself standing before it for hours, studying its contours, trying to decode its message. My work suffered. I called in sick repeatedly, unable to focus on anything but the face in my wall. The journal entries became my guide. The previous tenant had experienced the same obsession, the same compulsion to understand, but their final entries were different, darker. They wrote about dreams where the face spoke clearly, telling them about the space between the walls, about the others who had watched and waited. "It's not alone," the last entry read. "There are more, they're all trying to get out." I started noticing other cracks throughout the apartment, smaller ones following the same organic pattern. They appeared in the bathroom, the kitchen, the hallway. Each one seemed to be reaching toward the main wall, like tributaries flowing into a river. The sounds changed too. The tapping became more complex, more rhythmic. Sometimes it sounded like Morse code, other times like a heartbeat. I learned to distinguish between different patterns, different messages. The wall was definitely trying to communicate. I brought home specialized equipment, audio recorders, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors. The readings were inconsistent but undeniable. Temperature fluctuations near the wall, electromagnetic anomalies that spiked whenever the tapping intensified. Something was there, something that registered on my instruments even if I couldn't see it directly. The face looked at me now, I was certain of it. When I entered the room, the cracks would shift almost imperceptibly, the eyes focusing on my movements. When I left, I could feel its attention following me, a weight that pressed against my back until I was out of range. I started leaving offerings, food at first, then personal items. A photograph, a piece of jewelry, a handwritten note. Everything disappeared by morning, somehow absorbed into the wall itself. The face would look more peaceful afterward, its expression softer, more grateful. But the peace never lasted. The desperation would return, stronger than before. The tapping would become frantic, almost violent. The dust would fall in thick clouds, coating everything in the room with that strange, metallic powder. I stopped trying to clean it up. The accumulation was part of the process, part of whatever was happening. I could feel the wall changing, becoming more porous, more permeable. Sometimes I thought I could see through it, glimpses of darkness beyond the plaster and paint. The camera finally captured something concrete. In a single frame, taken during one of the violent tapping episodes, I could see a hand pressed against the inside of the wall. Fingers splayed, palm flat, pushing outward against the barrier. The image was blurry, distorted, but unmistakable. Someone was trapped inside. I brought home a sledgehammer. The face watched as I raised it, its expression shifting from hope to terror. The first blow sent cracks radiating outward from the impact point. The second opened a hole the size of my fist. The third revealed darkness beyond, thick and absolute. The smell that emerged was overwhelming. Not decay or rot, but something older, more fundamental. The smell of deep earth, of places that had never seen sunlight. I shone a flashlight into the opening and saw nothing but void. The tapping stopped. The face looked different now, incomplete with part of its structure damaged. But its eyes remained, staring at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. Accusation, gratitude, warning. I widened the hole, pulling away chunks of plaster and drywall. The void beyond seemed to expand with each piece I removed, growing larger than the space should have allowed. The darkness was total, swallowing my flashlight beam after only inches. Something moved in the depths, not the hand I had seen in the photograph, but something else. Something that writhed and shifted in the blackness, too large and too fluid to be human. The face in the wall began to crack again, new fractures spreading outward from the damaged area. I sealed the hole with boards and nails, but the damage was done. The barrier between spaces had been breached. The apartment felt different now, larger somehow, with rooms that stretched beyond their original dimensions. Shadows fell at impossible angles. Sounds echoed longer than they should. The face healed itself within days. The cracks realigned, the features reformed, but something had changed. The expression was no longer one of trapped desperation. It was satisfied, patient, waiting. I found more journals hidden throughout the apartment, dozens of them written by different hands, different tenants who had lived here over the years, all documenting the same phenomenon, the same progression from curiosity to obsession to understanding. The final entries were always the same, a realization that the wall wasn't a prison, but a door. And I had opened it. The face still watches me now, but I understand what it's telling me. The space between the walls isn't empty, it's full of things that have been waiting for someone to notice them, to acknowledge their presence, to finally let them through. I've started my own journal. Future tenants will need to understand what they're dealing with. The crack will return, it always does, and when it forms the face again, they'll have a choice. They can ignore it, patch it, pretend it doesn't exist, or they can do what I did, what everyone eventually does. They can let it out. The face is smiling now, or maybe it's grimacing. In this light, with these shadows, it's impossible to tell the difference. Story 2, I walked past it dozens of times a day, just a window overlooking the garden, but yesterday it reflected more than it should. I caught movement behind me in the glass, but when I turned around, nothing was there. It kept happening, shifts, flickers, shapes at the edge of recognition. Then I saw it clearly, a silhouette standing still just behind my shoulder. I spun, heart pounding, empty. But when I looked again, the figure hadn't moved. Only this time it was facing me. The glass felt cold against my palm as I pressed closer, studying every detail of the reflection. The figure stood perfectly still, its outline sharp against the distorted background of my living room. Its posture was wrong somehow, too rigid, like a photograph burned into the surface. I could make out the suggestion of clothing, dark and flowing, but no features, just that terrible, patient stillness. I backed away from the window, my breath fogging the glass. The condensation spread in thin tendrils, and for a moment I thought I saw something else, patterns in the moisture that looked almost like letters, forming and dissolving before I could read them. The air in the room had changed too, carrying a faint metallic taste that made my tongue feel heavy. That evening I positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the window. I kept a notebook beside me, documenting every anomaly. The reflection of the ceiling lamp flickered intermittently, though the actual light remained steady. The coffee table appeared closer to the window in the glass than it actually was, and always, lurking at the periphery of the reflection, that motionless figure. I tried covering the window with a blanket, but the fabric seemed to repel my touch near the glass, sliding away as if the surface had become somehow slick. The weight of the blanket felt different too, heavier on one side as though something invisible was pulling it down. When I removed it, the reflection had changed again. The figure had moved closer. The next day I brought my phone to record what I was seeing. The camera captured the window clearly, but when I played back the footage, the reflection showed only what should have been there, my furniture, the garden beyond, nothing else. Yet as I watched the phone screen, I could still see the figure in my peripheral vision, standing in the actual window reflection beside me. I started sleeping in a different room, but the dreams began immediately. I would find myself standing at the window, staring out at a garden that wasn't mine. The plants grew in geometric patterns, their leaves rustling without wind. Behind me I could hear breathing that matched my own rhythm perfectly, like an echo delayed by exactly one heartbeat. When I tried to turn around in these dreams, my neck would refuse to move, muscles locked in place. The sensation followed me into waking. My neck began to ache constantly, a dull throb that intensified whenever I was near the window. I found myself unconsciously tilting my head away from the glass, as if some primitive part of my brain was trying to avoid seeing what was reflected there. I decided to break the window. The hammer felt unusually heavy in my grip, and the glass surface seemed to ripple slightly as I approached. But when I swung, the hammer passed through the air with no resistance, as if the window had briefly ceased to exist. My hand struck the wall behind it, scraping against brick where glass should have been. When I looked up, the window was intact, unchanged. The figure in the reflection had moved again. It stood directly behind where I was positioned, close enough that I should have been able to feel its presence. The air behind me felt thick, resistant, like moving through water. I could smell something now, old paper and copper, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach clench. I began to notice other changes. The reflection of my own face looked tired, older than it should. Dark circles had appeared under my eyes, and my skin had taken on a grayish pallor that didn't match what I saw in other mirrors. Sometimes, when I blinked, the reflection would blink a fraction of a second later, as if struggling to keep up. The notebook I'd been using to document everything started filling with entries I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine, but the words described things I'd never seen, conversations with the figure, detailed observations of its movements, theories about what it wanted. According to these notes, it had been trying to communicate, tracing symbols in the condensation on the glass that I had somehow missed. On the last night I spent in that house, I woke to find myself standing at the window again. But this time I was awake. The reflection showed my room exactly as it was, except for one detail: I wasn't in it. The figure stood alone in the glass, no longer behind me, but in my exact position, wearing my clothes, carrying my posture. It raised one hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside. I lifted my own hand without thinking, matching the gesture. The glass felt warm now, pulsing with a rhythm that felt familiar. As our palms touched the surface from opposite sides, the reflection began to shift. The figure's features became clearer, more defined. I could see its eyes now, staring directly into mine with an expression of profound relief. The glass grew soft under my palm, yielding like thick liquid. I tried to pull my hand back, but the surface clung to my skin, drawing me forward. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of falling through the window, though I never felt myself hit the ground on the other side. I found myself in a new house the next morning, though I don't remember moving. The realtor's business card was in my pocket, along with keys I didn't recognize. The house was identical to my old one in every detail except for the window. It overlooks the same garden, reflects the same room. But now, when I look into the glass, I see someone else standing behind me, a figure I've never seen before, watching me with the same patient stillness I once observed. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself pressing my palm against the glass, feeling the surface grow warm and soft, knowing that somewhere on the other side, another hand is reaching back. Story 3, I noticed it while unlocking the door, faded red letters on a frayed mat I'd never seen before. Welcome back, I don't own a mat, no one had visited. I live alone. I kicked it aside, unsettled, but not enough to act. That night I woke up to a scraping noise near the entrance. In the morning the mat was back, a bit darker now, damp around the edges. And this time the message had changed: you're late. The fabric felt different under my fingers, rougher, almost organic. I pressed harder, and the fibers seemed to pulse with a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. My apartment building hallway smelled of old carpet and cleaning products, but now there was something else. Something metallic and sweet, like copper pennies left in honey. I carried the mat inside and placed it on my kitchen counter. Under the fluorescent light, the letters appeared more defined, as if they'd been refreshed overnight. I took a photograph with my phone, then another. In the second photo, the text looked blurred, incomplete. I deleted both images and tried again. This time, my phone's camera wouldn't focus properly. The next morning, I found the mat back outside my door. The message had evolved. You kept me waiting. I decided to document everything. I started a journal, writing down each change, each peculiarity. The mat's color shifted from red to burgundy to something approaching rust. The texture became more pronounced, developing what felt like raised veins running beneath the surface. When I touched these lines, my fingertips tingled with a sensation that lingered for hours. My neighbor across the hall walked by as I was examining the mat. She glanced down, then looked directly at me with confusion. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You're just standing there staring at the floor." I pointed to the mat. She looked again, her expression unchanged. "What mat?" That afternoon, I set up my laptop to record the hallway. I positioned the camera to capture the area in front of my door, then went inside to wait. Every few minutes, I checked the live feed. The mat remained visible on screen, but something was wrong with the video quality. The image flickered occasionally, and static lines ran across the frame whenever the camera focused on the mat's surface. I reviewed the footage later. For hours, nothing happened. Then, during a period when I'd been in the bathroom, the mat vanished from the video entirely. Not gradually, between one frame and the next, it simply wasn't there. Yet when I opened my door, the mat remained exactly where I'd left it. The message now read, "I've been patient." I tried moving the mat to different locations. I placed it in my closet, sealed it in a plastic bag, even threw it down the garbage chute. Each time it returned to my doorstep by morning, each time slightly changed. The edges became more frayed, revealing what looked like darker material underneath. The smell grew stronger, no longer sweet, but acrid and organic, like decomposing leaves mixed with something I couldn't identify. I started losing sleep, not from fear, but from fascination. I found myself checking the mat multiple times throughout the night, sometimes catching it mid-transformation. The letters would shift and flow like liquid, rearranging themselves into new configurations. I began to recognize patterns in the changes, a rhythm that seemed to respond to my attention. When I focused intensely on the mat, the words became clearer, more insistent. When I ignored it, they faded but never disappeared entirely. I realized I was feeding it somehow, with my curiosity, my documentation, my inability to leave it alone. The mat grew larger. What had been a simple rectangle now stretched beyond the boundaries of my doorframe. The excess material folded and twisted, creating shadows that moved independently of the hallway lighting. I measured it repeatedly, but my tape measure gave different readings each time. The mat defied consistency, existing in dimensions that shifted based on observation. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering my phone. I spent days sitting in my hallway, watching the mat evolve. The messages became more complex, more personal. They referenced things I'd never told anyone, childhood memories, private fears, dreams I'd forgotten upon waking. The mat knew me in ways I didn't know myself. One evening, I placed my hand flat against the surface. The mat was warm, almost body temperature. I pressed harder and my palm began to sink into the material, not breaking through but being absorbed. The sensation was neither painful nor pleasant, simply inevitable. I tried to pull away, but the mat held me gently, insistently. The letters rearranged themselves around my trapped hand, finally. I understood then that the mat wasn't waiting for me to solve its mystery. It was waiting for me to stop trying to. Every photograph I'd taken, every note I'd written, every attempt to understand, I'd been completing something. a process that required my participation, my surrender to the inexplicable. When I finally managed to extract my hand, the skin was unmarked but fundamentally changed. It felt different, more sensitive, as if it had been exposed to something that existed between textures. The sensation spread up my arm over the following days, an awareness that my body was no longer entirely my own. The mat still waits outside my door. The messages have stopped changing, settled into a single, constant phrase. You understand now. I do understand, though I couldn't explain it to anyone else. The mat was never meant to be solved or removed. It was meant to be accepted, integrated into the fabric of my daily existence. I no longer try to document its behavior. I no longer question its presence. I simply step over it when I leave and acknowledge it when I return. We have reached an understanding. The mat and I, it knows I'll never stop being curious about it, and I know it will never stop being there. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that scraping sound again. But now I recognize it for what it is, not the mat moving, but the sound of my own certainty being slowly worn away, thread by thread. Story 4, I could hear everything, not just the neighbors, but footsteps inside the house, slow, uneven, circling. I placed my palm flat against the drywall and felt it, vibration, not from music or talking, but something rhythmic, like fingers tapping. I knocked, something knocked back. I moved to another wall, the same. I took a hammer and peeled a section away. No wiring, no beams, just empty blackness stretching deeper than any wall should, and something moving inside it. The apartment had been perfect when I first walked through it. Clean lines, fresh paint, that particular smell of new construction that promises a fresh start. The landlord mentioned the walls were specially insulated for soundproofing, which seemed like a blessing after years of paper-thin rentals where every conversation became public property. I signed the lease that same afternoon. The first week passed in blissful silence. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my furniture, and marveled at how peaceful everything felt. Even the busy street outside seemed muffled, as if the building existed in its own quiet bubble. I started sleeping better than I had in months, my dreams uninterrupted by the usual urban symphony of sirens and late-night arguments. Then the tapping started. It began subtly, so faint I thought it might be pipes settling or the building adjusting to temperature changes. A gentle rhythm against the bedroom wall, always in the same spot, always the same pattern, tap tap pause tap. I pressed my ear against the cool surface and listened. The sound seemed to come from deep within the wall itself, not from the apartment next door. I knocked gently, the tapping stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then it resumed, but this time it matched my rhythm exactly. When I knocked twice, it responded with 2 taps. When I tried 3 quick knocks, it echoed back perfectly. A chill ran down my spine, but I rationalized it away. Sound travels in strange ways through buildings. The neighbor was probably just responding to what they thought was a message from me. Over the following days, the phenomenon spread. I discovered the same responsive tapping in the kitchen wall, then the living room, then the bathroom. Each wall seemed to have its own presence, its own rhythm. The bedroom wall preferred slow, deliberate taps. The kitchen wall responded with quick, almost excited bursts. The living room wall created complex patterns that sounded almost like Morse code. I started documenting everything. I bought a small recorder and began cataloging the different sounds, noting which walls responded and how. I sketched the floor plan and marked each location where I heard the tapping. The pattern that emerged made no architectural sense. According to my measurements, some of the sounds came from walls that should have been exterior, facing the street. Others came from walls that should have backed up to the building's central stairwell. The temperature changes started around the same time. I would place my hand against a wall and feel it suddenly grow warm, then cold, then warm again. The sensation reminded me of touching someone's forehead to check for fever, except the wall's temperature seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. I bought a digital thermometer and began taking readings. The variations were real, sometimes as much as 15 degrees difference between spots only inches apart. The smell came next. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was wrong. sweet and metallic like copper pennies mixed with vanilla extract. It would appear suddenly, fill a room for a few minutes, then vanish completely. I checked for gas leaks, examined the ventilation system, even called the landlord to ask about recent maintenance. Everything checked out fine. The building was new, the systems were clean, there was no logical explanation for the odor. I began spending hours with my ear pressed against various walls, trying to understand what I was hearing. The tapping had evolved into something more complex. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth inside the wall itself. Other times it resembled whispered conversations, too muffled to make out individual words, but unmistakably human in their rhythm and cadence. One evening I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I went to the hardware store and bought a small sledgehammer, some plastic sheeting, and a flashlight. If there was something behind these walls, I was going to find it. I started with the bedroom wall, the one where I first heard the tapping. I spread the plastic sheeting on the floor and took my first swing. The drywall cracked easily, revealing the dark space behind it. I expected to see wooden studs, insulation, maybe some wiring. Instead, my flashlight beam disappeared into what looked like an endless void. The space behind the wall extended far beyond where the neighboring apartment should have been. I could feel air movement, a subtle current that suggested the space was vast and connected to something larger. I made the hole bigger, large enough to shine my light in different directions. The beam revealed nothing but darkness in every direction. The walls of this hidden space seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I reached my hand inside and felt nothing but empty air. When I called out, my voice echoed back strangely, as if the space had unusual acoustics. That's when I saw movement. Something shifted in the darkness just at the edge of my flashlight's range. Not the quick scurry of a rodent or the flutter of a bat, but something larger, more deliberate. It seemed to retreat when the light hit it, sliding away into the deeper darkness. I called out again, and this time I heard a response, not an echo, but something that sounded almost like a voice, distorted and hollow. I pulled my hand back and stepped away from the hole. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Old buildings sometimes had unusual spaces, architectural quirks that created pockets of dead air. Maybe there was a problem with the building's construction, some mistake in the blueprints that created these voids. But the tapping continued, and now it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I could hear it in the walls, in the floor, even in the ceiling. The sound was no longer responsive to my knocks. It had taken on a life of its own, creating complex rhythms that seemed to communicate with each other across the hidden network of spaces. I tried to cover the hole with plastic, but the material wouldn't stay in place. Every morning I would find it crumpled on the floor, as if something had pushed it away from the inside. The sweet, metallic smell grew stronger, and I began to taste it in my mouth even when I wasn't in the apartment. The temperature fluctuations became more extreme, and I started finding frost on the walls in the morning despite the warm weather outside. The sounds evolved again. What had started as simple tapping became more complex, more articulate. I could swear I heard my name being called, always from deep within the walls, always too muffled to be certain. I started recording everything, playing back the audio at different speeds, filtering out background noise. In the recordings, I could make out what sounded like multiple voices, overlapping and interweaving in conversations I couldn't quite understand. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom and moved to the couch, but the sounds followed me. The living room walls began their own chorus, and I realized that whatever was inside the walls wasn't confined to one location. It was everywhere, moving through the building like blood through veins, connected and alive and aware of my presence. The hole in the bedroom wall grew larger each night. I would measure it before going to sleep and find it expanded by morning, the edges clean and precise as if someone had carefully carved away more material. I bought a surveillance camera and pointed it at the wall, but the footage showed nothing but empty darkness. The hole simply grew, pixel by pixel, frame by frame, with no visible cause. I called the landlord, but when he came to investigate, he saw only normal walls. He looked at me with concern and suggested I might be under stress, that I should perhaps talk to someone about what I was experiencing. But I could see the confusion in his eyes when he touched the wall where I had made the hole. To him, it was solid drywall, unmarked and intact. The voices became clearer. They spoke in languages I didn't recognize, but their tone was unmistakably urgent, as if they were trying to warn me about something. I started leaving the apartment during the day, spending hours in coffee shops and libraries, but I always had to return. The apartment had become a magnet, pulling me back with an irresistible force. The final night, I decided to go deeper. I enlarged the hole until it was big enough to crawl through. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I squeezed through the opening and into the darkness beyond. My flashlight revealed a space that defied physics, corridors that shouldn't exist, rooms that extended beyond the building's footprint, stairs that led to floors that couldn't be there. I found others, not people exactly, but shapes that had once been human, now stretched and distorted, pressed flat against the inner surfaces of the walls. They were still alive, still aware, their eyes tracking my movement as I passed. Their mouths moved soundlessly, trying to communicate something desperate and urgent. I understood then that the walls weren't just thin, they were permeable. The boundary between the apartment and this other space was dissolving, and I was being pulled through. The tapping, the voices, the temperature changes, they were all signs of the transformation beginning. I tried to find my way back, but the opening I had come through was gone. The corridors all looked the same, stretching endlessly in directions that made no geometric sense. My flashlight began to dim, and I realized I was becoming part of the building's hidden anatomy, another voice in the walls, another presence tapping out warnings to the next tenant. The apartment is still there, freshly painted and ready for someone new. The walls have been repaired, the soundproofing restored. But sometimes, late at night, the new tenant might hear a familiar rhythm from within the walls, tap, tap, pause, tap, and if they're foolish enough to investigate, they might find that the walls are exactly as thin as they need to be. Story 5, flip up, lights off, flip down, lights on. I assumed it was faulty wiring, but an electrician couldn't explain it. The fixtures were normal, the power was fine, still the switch behaved wrong. I tried to replace it, but every new switch acted the same. Then I noticed something else. The lights only turned off when I was near the switch. If I tried using it from a distance, with a stick, a glove, anything, the light stayed on, like it wanted me to be close. The apartment smelled of copper and something else, something sweet and metallic that lingered in the corners where shadows gathered. I'd lived here for months, but that scent had appeared only after the switch began its strange behavior. Every morning, I'd wake to find the living room bathed in darkness, though I always left the lights on before sleeping. The switch would be flipped up, waiting. I started keeping a journal. Day 1, switch flipped itself during the night. Day 2, same thing, but the bulb felt warm to the touch despite being off for hours. Day 3, I heard a soft clicking sound from the wall when I approached, like something settling into place. The sound only happened when I was alone. My neighbor from across the hall mentioned hearing electrical humming through the walls, but the humming wasn't coming from my circuits, it was coming from somewhere deeper, like the building itself was breathing. I pressed my ear against the wall beside the switch and felt a faint vibration, rhythmic and deliberate. The plaster was always cold, even on warm days, and sometimes my fingers would stick to it slightly, as if drawn by some invisible force. I installed a camera to watch the switch while I slept. The footage showed nothing unusual, just me walking to the switch each morning, flipping it down and the lights turning on. But I knew I wasn't walking to the switch. I was waking up there, standing in front of it, with no memory of getting out of bed. My feet would be cold, and there would be a taste in my mouth like old pennies. The electrician returned with more sophisticated equipment. He found readings that shouldn't exist, electrical patterns that formed no recognizable circuit, energy flowing in directions that defied basic physics. He left without finishing his work, mumbling about insurance liability and things he couldn't explain in his report. Before he left, he touched the switch once. His hand jerked back immediately, and he stared at his palm where a small, perfect circle had formed, not a burn, but a mark that looked like it had always been there. I began testing the switch obsessively. It responded only to direct contact with my skin. Gloves, tools, even a thin piece of paper between my finger and the switch, nothing worked. The light would flicker uncertainly, then remain on. But the moment my bare skin touched the plastic, the response was immediate and wrong. Up for off, down for on, always. The humming grew louder. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore, it was coming from behind them, from spaces that shouldn't exist. I started mapping the sound, following it through the apartment. It led me to corners where the shadows seemed too deep, to spots where the air felt thick and resistant. I found myself spending hours tracing the sound, losing track of everything else. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began changing. Subtle at first, my eyes looked tired, then hollow, then something else entirely. The reflection would move a fraction of a second behind my actual movements, like it was copying me rather than being me. When I smiled, it would smile back, but the expression never quite matched. And behind my reflection, in the mirror's depths, I could see the living room light switch, always visible no matter what angle I looked from. The journal entries became harder to write. My handwriting kept changing, becoming more precise, more geometric. The words I wrote weren't always the words I meant to write. Instead of "the switch feels warm," I'd write "the switch feels ready." Instead of "I'm getting worried," I'd write "I'm getting closer." Reading back through the entries, I realized I'd been documenting not just the switch's behavior, but my own transformation. One night I woke standing at the switch with my finger already pressed against it. The light was off, but I could see everything perfectly, too perfectly. The shadows had texture now, depth and substance. They moved independently of their sources, flowing like slow water across the walls. In the darkness, I could see other switches, dozens of them covering every surface of the room. All of them were flipped up. All of them were waiting. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My finger remained pressed against the switch, and I could feel something flowing through it, not electricity, but something that recognized me, claimed me. The sweet metallic smell intensified until it filled my lungs completely. Every breath tasted of copper and promises. The humming stopped. In the silence, I heard my own voice, but it wasn't coming from my throat. It was coming from inside the walls, from behind the switch, from the spaces between spaces. My voice was saying things I'd never said, explaining things I'd never understood. It was telling me about the way light works backward in certain places, about how some switches connect to more than just bulbs, about how some apartments choose their tenants very carefully. When the sun rose, I found myself back in bed, but the taste of copper never left my mouth. The switch worked normally during the day, up for on, down for off, but every night in the darkness it remembered what it really was, and every night I remembered what I was becoming. The journal sits on my table now, filling itself with words I don't remember writing. The apartment smells of copper and something else, something that might be me changing. And the switch waits, patient and backward, knowing that some connections, once made, can never be undone. My reflection doesn't copy me anymore, it leads. Story 6, not metaphorically, not creaking or settling, breathing. The wallpaper would ripple slightly in and out in a slow, pulsing rhythm. I thought I was hallucinating until I pressed my hand to it. It was warm, soft. I felt a thud beneath the surface, then another, like a heartbeat. I pushed harder, something pushed back. The apartment had always been quiet, too quiet maybe. The kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of floorboards, the whisper of air through old vents, but this was different. This was the sound of something alive. I'd been living here for months, never noticing anything unusual about the bedroom wall. The wallpaper was old, a faded pattern of roses and vines that the previous tenant had left behind. I'd planned to replace it eventually, but somehow never got around to it. Now I was grateful for the procrastination. Without that thin layer of paper, I might never have seen it. The movement started subtly. A a slight shift in the pattern as if the roses were swaying in an invisible breeze. At first, I blamed fatigue. Long shifts at work, poor sleep, too much coffee. But as the days passed, the motion became more pronounced. The wall would expand and contract, a gentle rise and fall that reminded me of watching someone sleep. I started documenting it. Photos, videos, measurements. In daylight, the wall looked normal, perfectly still. But in the dim light of evening or the blue glow of my phone screen, the breathing became unmistakable. I recorded hours of footage, watching the wallpaper pulse with mechanical regularity. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost soothing. That's when I noticed the temperature changes. The wall would grow warm during its expansion, then cool as it contracted. I bought a digital thermometer and tracked the variations. The difference was slight, maybe 2 or 3 degrees, but consistent. The pattern never varied. The smell came next, sweet at first, like flowers left too long in water, then something else underneath, something organic and rich. I pressed my face close to the wall, breathing deeply. The scent was strongest during the breathing cycles, as if the wall was exhaling. I started keeping a journal, noting every detail. The breathing seemed to follow a pattern, but not one I could predict. Sometimes it would be barely perceptible, other times so pronounced that I worried the neighbors might notice. I knocked on the wall, listened for hollow spaces, checked for pipes or electrical wiring that might explain the phenomenon. Nothing. The wallpaper began to change. The roses seemed more vibrant, their petals fuller. The vines appeared to twist and grow, creating new patterns I was certain hadn't been there before. I compared photos from different days, measuring the positions of individual flowers. They were moving, slowly but definitely shifting across the wall's surface. I decided to look behind the wallpaper. Using a craft knife, I carefully cut a small section near the corner. The paper peeled away easily, revealing the wall beneath. The plaster was smooth, unmarked, perfectly normal. But as I watched, a small bump appeared, pushing outward from within. Then another. The surface rippled like water. I pressed my ear to the exposed plaster. There was a sound, faint but distinct, a whisper too soft to understand. I cupped my hands around my ear, straining to hear. The whisper became clearer, almost like words, but in a language I didn't recognize. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the wall. The breathing had become more rapid, more urgent. The temperature fluctuations were extreme now, shifting from uncomfortably warm to surprisingly cool. The sweet smell had intensified, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of rain on hot pavement. I got up and pressed both palms against the wall. The surface yielded slightly under pressure, like pressing into soft clay. My hands left impressions that slowly filled back in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I thought I heard my name, but I couldn't be sure. The next morning I woke to find my hands stained. A reddish-brown substance clung to my palms, dried and flaky. I scrubbed them clean, but the stains returned by evening. The wall was seeping something through my skin. I tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize what was happening. Old building, settling foundation, unusual humidity. But the explanations felt hollow. The wall was alive and it was trying to communicate. I started talking to it, whispering questions, sharing my thoughts, telling it about my day. The breathing would sometimes change in response, becoming faster or slower, as if it was listening. The whispers grew more frequent, more urgent. One evening, as I sat recording another session, the wall suddenly bulged outward. A section about the size of my torso pushed into the room, straining against the wallpaper. I could see the pattern stretching, the roses distorting into grotesque shapes. The whispers became a chorus, multiple voices overlapping in languages I'd never heard. I reached out almost involuntarily and touched the bulge. It was warm, soft, pulsing with life. My hand sank into the surface and I felt something grasp my fingers from the other side. Something with the texture of skin, but wrong somehow. Too smooth, too warm, too eager. I tried to pull away, but the grip tightened. The wall began to pull me in, drawing my hand deeper into whatever lay behind the plaster. The whispers became screams, a cacophony of voices demanding my attention. The sweet smell turned sour, overwhelming, making me gag. With my free hand, I grabbed the craft knife and slashed at the wallpaper. The paper tore away in long strips, revealing the wall beneath, but it wasn't plaster anymore. It was flesh, pink and mottled, covered in a network of pulsing veins. The breathing wasn't the wall's rhythm, it was the rhythm of something trapped inside. The grip on my hand released suddenly, and I stumbled backward. The exposed flesh writhed, trying to reform itself. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, mournful moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I ran from the apartment that night, staying in a hotel until I could find somewhere else to live, but I couldn't escape the stains on my hands. They spread up my arms, faint at first, then darker. The whispers followed me too, softer now, but always present. I still don't know what I found behind that wall. Sometimes I think it was something that had been waiting there long before I arrived, something that had been breathing in the dark for years, maybe decades. Other times I wonder if I created it somehow, if my attention and documentation had given it life. The stains continue to spread. They don't hurt, but they're warm to the touch, and sometimes I swear I can feel them pulsing with their own rhythm. The whispers have become clearer too. They speak in my voice now, telling me things I don't remember saying, sharing memories that aren't mine. I've learned to live with it, this connection to something beyond understanding. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself searching for another apartment, another wall that might be breathing. Because now I know the truth, I wasn't just observing that wall, I was feeding it, and it's still hungry. Story 7, I hadn't lived there in years. It was supposed to be abandoned, but when I returned, the place was clean. Lights worked. Photos were framed on the walls, images of me I never remembered taking. The furniture was exactly as I left it, even the dent in the couch cushion where I used to sit. I walked room to room, heart racing. Then I saw it, a dinner plate on the table, steaming, my favorite meal, and a second chair pulled out. The smell of jasmine lingered in the air, though no flowers grew near the house. My fingers traced the edge of the dining table, feeling the familiar grooves I'd carved as a child. The wood was warm, warmer than it should have been in the cold season. I approached the steaming plate slowly, the aroma of roasted herbs and garlic making my stomach clench with unexpected hunger. The second chair bothered me most. It sat at an angle as if someone had just risen from it. I circled the table, studying the scene. 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, 2 glasses filled with water that still had condensation beating on the sides. Fresh, recent. I called out, my voice echoing through rooms I knew were empty. No response came, but I heard something else, a faint humming, like electricity running through old wires. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, a low vibration that made my teeth ache. The photographs drew me back to the living room, frame after frame of images I couldn't place in my memory. There I was, sitting in the garden, smiling at something beyond the camera's view. Another showed me reading a book I'd never owned, in a chair that looked different from how I remembered it. In each photo, I appeared content, peaceful, as if I belonged there completely. I pulled out my phone to document what I was seeing, but the screen remained black. The device felt strangely heavy in my hands, like it had absorbed moisture from the air. I tried the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The phone had been working perfectly during my drive here. Moving to the kitchen, I found the refrigerator humming softly, its interior light casting a pale glow when I opened the door. Inside, food waited in neat rows, my preferred brands, my usual choices. Milk that should have expired long ago still smelled fresh. Vegetables that should have rotted looked crisp and ready to eat. Everything organized exactly as I used to arrange it. The basement door stood slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it that way. Cool air drifted up from below, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. I descended the wooden stairs, each step creaking in the same familiar pattern I remembered from childhood. The basement looked different than I'd left it. Tools hung on pegboards in perfect arrangements. Boxes were stacked with military precision, each labeled in handwriting that looked like mine but felt foreign. I approached one box and lifted the lid. Inside, journals filled with my thoughts and observations, written in my hand, but documenting experiences I'd never had. I read entries describing daily routines in this house, conversations with neighbors I'd never met, problems I'd never faced. The writing was detailed, intimate, as if I'd lived a parallel life within these walls. The dates spanned years, continuing long after I'd moved away. One entry caught my attention. The visitor comes sometimes, looking confused. They think they used to live here. I prepare their favorite meal and wait, but they never stay long enough to understand. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. More entries followed, each describing my previous visits I had no memory of making. The journal recorded my reactions, my words, even my movements through the house. Someone had been watching me, documenting my behavior with scientific precision. I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked in a pattern I recognized, my own walking rhythm. I climbed the stairs quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The basement door closed behind me with a soft click, though I hadn't touched it. The dinner plate was gone from the table. In its place sat a note written in my handwriting, "Welcome home, I've been waiting." I searched every room, calling out, demanding answers. The house responded with silence, except for that persistent humming that seemed to grow louder whenever I stopped moving. The walls felt different now, slightly soft when I pressed against them, as if they were breathing. In the bedroom, I found clothes laid out on the bed, my clothes, but cleaner than I remembered, pressed and arranged as if for a special occasion. The covers were turned down, and the pillow bore the impression of a head that had rested there recently. The bathroom mirror showed my reflection, but something was wrong with it. My image seemed to lag behind my movements, just slightly out of sync. I raised my hand, and my reflection followed a heartbeat later. I moved my head, and the reflected version turned with a delay that made my skin crawl. I tried to leave then, but the front door handle wouldn't turn. The metal was ice cold against my palm, and when I pulled my hand away, I could see the outline of my fingerprints frosted on the surface. The windows were sealed shut, their latches refusing to budge despite my increasingly desperate attempts. The house began to feel smaller, as if the walls were slowly contracting. I ran from room to room, checking every exit, every window, every possible escape route. Nothing worked. The humming grew louder, and I realized it was coming from inside my own head now, a vibration that started in my skull and spread through my entire body. I found myself back in the dining room where a fresh plate waited. The second chair was pulled out again, and I could see the impression of someone sitting in it, someone who had just left. The food was still warm, steam rising in delicate spirals that seemed to form shapes in the air. I sat down across from the empty chair and began to eat. The food tasted exactly as I remembered, seasoned perfectly, prepared with care. As I ate, I noticed that the humming in my head was synchronizing with my heartbeat, creating a rhythm that felt almost musical. The photographs on the walls began to change. New images appeared in the frames, pictures of me sitting at this very table, eating this very meal. In real time, they captured my current actions, showing me from angles that should have been impossible. I was being watched, recorded, preserved. I stand up from the table, but my legs feel heavy, reluctant to carry me away. The house wants me to stay, I realize. It has been preparing for my return, maintaining itself, keeping my life ready for whenever I decided to come back. The journals in the basement weren't written by someone watching me. They were written by me during visits I've somehow forgotten. The humming stops suddenly, and in the silence, I hear my own voice calling from upstairs. I'm home. I look at the empty chair across from me, and for just a moment I see myself sitting there, smiling, welcoming me back. The house remembered me, but now I'm beginning to remember the house too, and I understand that leaving was never really an option. I wake up in my bed, the same bed where I found the clothes laid out, but I don't remember falling asleep. Light filters through windows I couldn't open, and I can smell breakfast cooking downstairs. My favorite meal is waiting, still steaming, still fresh. The house remembered me, and now it's teaching me to remember myself. Story 8, every time I looked into it, something felt reversed, not left and right depth. Instead of my front, the mirror reflected my back, my shoulders, the back of my head. I turned in place, confused. The mirror stayed static, frozen, showing me only what I couldn't see. Then I noticed something else, a shape behind me, one I knew wasn't in the room. The antique mirror had arrived that morning, wrapped in cloth that smelled of lavender and decay. The delivery person had left it propped against my bedroom wall without explanation. I'd been expecting furniture, but this wasn't what I'd ordered. The ornate bronze frame felt warm under my fingertips, almost alive. When I first approached it, the reflection seemed normal. Then I blinked and everything changed. I stepped closer, watching my own back move in the glass. The fabric of my shirt wrinkled differently in the reflection. My hair fell in directions that defied gravity, but it was the shadow behind my reflected form that made my skin crawl. Tall, angular, with movements that didn't match mine. When I raised my hand, it remained still. When I stepped sideways, it followed a beat too late. I grabbed my phone and started recording. The screen showed my face, normal and forward-facing, but the mirror behind me in the phone's display still showed my back. The shadow was there too, clearer now through the camera lens. Its outline suggested a person, but the proportions were wrong. Too thin, too tall, arms that reached below where knees should be. I circled the mirror, studying every angle. The reflection never wavered, always my back, always that presence lurking behind me. I touched the glass surface. It felt cold now, though the frame remained warm. My reflected hand appeared to touch something solid, but from the wrong direction. The mirror showed my knuckles pressing against what should have been empty air. The shadow moved independently now. While my reflection remained relatively still, it swayed like seaweed in deep water. I leaned closer to examine its features, but the glass began to fog with my breath. When it cleared, the shadow had moved closer to my reflected form, close enough that I could see it had no face, just a smooth, dark surface where features should have been. I called my neighbor, describing what I was seeing. She arrived within minutes, but when she looked into the mirror, she saw only her own normal reflection. She watched me stare at what appeared to be nothing unusual. Her confused expression made me question my sanity. But when I looked at her phone screen as she recorded me, there it was again. My back, the shadow, growing larger. That night I covered the mirror with a blanket, but I could still feel it watching. The room temperature dropped several degrees. The blanket began to slip as if something was pulling it from behind the glass. I caught it before it fell completely, but my hand touched the mirror's surface. The cold shot through my arm like electricity. In that instant, I felt the shadow's presence more strongly than ever. It wasn't just watching anymore, it was reaching. I moved the mirror to my basement, face against the wall, but the strange reflections followed me. Every reflective surface in my house began showing the same impossible view. Bathroom mirrors, my computer screen when it went black, even the surface of water in my kitchen sink. Always my back, always that growing shadow. The shadow began to change. It developed details that shouldn't exist. Clothing that rippled in non-existent wind. Hair that moved independently of gravity. And slowly, terrifyingly, it began to resemble someone I once knew. Someone who had vanished from my life without explanation years ago. The resemblance was subtle at first, then undeniable. I returned to the basement mirror, pulling it away from the wall. The shadow now stood directly behind my reflection, close enough that they almost touched. I could see its mouth moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I pressed my ear to the glass, and faintly, so faintly I thought I was imagining it, I heard my own voice whispering back to me from the other side. The whisper spoke of things I'd forgotten, memories I'd buried, secrets I'd never told anyone. As it spoke, the shadow began to solidify. Its features became clearer, more defined, more human, and more familiar. I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just resembling someone I once knew. It was becoming them, taking their form, their mannerisms, their presence. I tried to break the mirror, but every strike I made appeared to hit my reflection instead. The shadow caught each blow, absorbed each impact. With every attempt to destroy it, it grew stronger, more solid, more real. The distinction between the shadow and my reflection began to blur. I could no longer tell which was which. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of a switch, a reversal, a trade. The shadow wanted out. It wanted to take my place, to step through the glass and into my world. And I realized with dawning terror that it wasn't just asking, it was demanding. The mirror wasn't showing me my back, it was showing me my replacement. Now I sit here staring at the mirror that shows everything wrong. The shadow has my face now, perfect in every detail. It mimics my expressions, my movements, my very existence. And I can feel myself fading, becoming more transparent with each passing moment. The mirror grows warmer as I grow colder. The shadow grows more solid as I become more ethereal. I've stopped trying to break the mirror. I've stopped trying to understand it, because I realize now that the mirror isn't broken. It's working exactly as intended. It's showing me the truth I've been avoiding. The shadow isn't behind me, it's in front of me, and I'm the one who's been behind the glass all along. The reflection reaches toward me now, pressing its hand against the inside of the mirror. I can feel its warmth through the glass. Soon, very soon, our positions will be complete. It will step out into my world, and I will take its place in the reflection. A shadow behind someone else's back, waiting for my turn to whisper, to reach, to trade places again. The mirror shows my back because that's all I am now, the part of someone else that they can't see, the part they've forgotten, the part they've left behind. And when the switch is complete, when the shadow takes my place, someone new will stand before this mirror. Someone who doesn't know they're being watched, someone who doesn't know they're being replaced. Someone who will look into the mirror and see their own back staring back at them. Story 9, Up, Down. The count was always different. 12 steps one day, 15 the next. Sometimes I reached the top too soon, sometimes I didn't reach it at all. One night I climbed for what felt like forever, no top landing, just the same wallpapered wall repeating every few steps. I turned around, but the bottom was gone too. I wasn't climbing stairs anymore, I was being taken somewhere. The building was old, with those narrow wooden stairs that creaked under your weight. Each step had its own personality. The third one groaned like an old man. The seventh whistled softly when you put pressure on it. I'd been living there long enough to know their voices, to anticipate their sounds, but then they started changing. At first I thought I was miscounting. Stress does that to you, makes you forget simple things. I'd been working too much, sleeping too little, easy to explain away. But then I started paying attention, really paying attention. I'd count each step deliberately, pressing my palm against the banister, feeling the smooth wood worn down by countless hands before mine. 12 steps, always 12 steps from the lobby to the second floor. I'd counted them hundreds of times. But that Tuesday morning, as I descended with my coffee still steaming in my hand, I reached the bottom on step 9. I stopped, looked back up the staircase. The same familiar steps stretched above me, but somehow 3 of them had vanished overnight. The smell hit me then, something like wet concrete mixed with the metallic tang of old radiators. It shouldn't have been there. The building's heating system was modern, installed just 2 years ago, but the scent clung to the stairwell, growing stronger near the walls where the faded floral wallpaper met the wooden steps. I started documenting everything. A small notebook, black leather, where I recorded my daily counts, up in the morning, down in the evening. The numbers danced around 11, 14, 13, 16. Never 12 again. The other residents didn't seem to notice. They climbed and descended with the same casual indifference they'd always shown, chatting about weather and weekend plans. But I noticed other things too. The wallpaper pattern wasn't quite right. Those pink roses with their thorny stems, they seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking directly at them. Not moving exactly, but rearranging themselves. A rose that had been facing left would suddenly face right. A stem that curved upward would bend down. Subtle changes that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. The banister grew warm under my touch, even during the coldest days. Not the pleasant warmth of sunlight through windows, but something deeper, more unsettling, like touching skin that had been running a fever. I'd pull my hand away quickly, but the sensation lingered on my palm for hours afterward. My neighbor from the 4th floor started looking at me strangely. She'd pause when we passed on the stairs, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were trying to remember something important, but she never spoke about it. None of them did. They seemed to glide past the inconsistencies, their minds smoothing over the impossibilities like water flowing around stones. The recordings began accidentally. I'd been talking to myself, muttering the count under my breath, when I realized my phone was still recording from an earlier voice memo. When I played it back, underneath my voice counting 7, 8, 9, there was something else. A whisper so faint I had to turn the volume all the way up and press the speaker to my ear. It sounded like counting 2, but in reverse. 21, 2019, while I climbed up. That night I couldn't sleep. The building settled around me with its usual symphony of creaks and sighs, but there was something new. A rhythmic sound like footsteps on stairs, not unusual in an apartment building, except these footsteps never stopped. They climbed and descended with mechanical precision. I pressed my ear to the wall, following the sound. It was coming from the stairwell, but when I crept to my door and peered through the peephole, the stairs were empty. I started timing my climbs. Not with a watch, I'd learned to distrust mechanical measurements, but with my breathing, my heartbeat. One flight used to take me exactly 23 breaths. Now it varied wildly. Sometimes I'd reach the top gasping, as if I'd climbed a mountain. Other times I'd arrive feeling like I'd barely moved at all. The roses in the wallpaper began to smell, sweet at first, like real flowers, but with an underlying note of decay. The scent grew stronger as I climbed higher, until it became almost overwhelming near the top floors. I mentioned it to the landlord, suggested maybe there was a leak somewhere, water damage behind the walls. He looked at me with that same expression my neighbor had worn, puzzled, slightly concerned, like I was speaking a foreign language. My notebook filled with observations, the temperature variations, cold spots that moved up and down the staircase like invisible entities. The way shadows fell wrong, creating dark patches where there should have been light from the windows. The increasing frequency of that reverse whisper in my recordings, growing clearer each day. Then came the night I climbed forever. I'd been returning from a late shift, tired and looking forward to bed. The lobby was dimly lit, the same as always. I started up the stairs, counting automatically. 1, 2, 3. The third step groaned its familiar complaint. 7 whistled softly, but step 12 never came. I kept climbing, my legs moving mechanically, my hands sliding along the banister that seemed to extend infinitely upward. The wallpaper repeated in a pattern that made no sense. The same cluster of roses over and over like a broken film reel. I tried to stop, to turn around, but my feet wouldn't obey. They carried me upward, while the reverse whisper grew louder in my ears. 32, 31, 30, overlapping with my own breathless counting. When I finally looked back, the bottom of the staircase had vanished. Below me stretched the same repeating pattern of steps and roses, descending into darkness. Above me, more of the same, climbing toward a ceiling I couldn't see. I was trapped in a vertical loop, a spiral of impossibility. My phone's recording captured everything. My panicked breathing, my footsteps echoing in the enclosed space, and underneath it all, that whisper counting down from numbers I couldn't fathom. But when I tried to play it back later, the audio was corrupted, static and distortion, with only fragments of sound bleeding through. I woke up in my bed the next morning, fully clothed, my shoes still on. The notebook was open beside me, filled with my handwriting, but the words made no sense. Numbers scattered across the pages like rain, connected by lines that formed no pattern I could understand. My palm was burned, a perfect rectangle of blistered skin where I'd gripped the banister too tightly. The stairs still change length. I've stopped counting, but I can feel the difference in my bones. Some days I climb through normal space, reaching my floor in a reasonable number of steps. Other days I climb through something else entirely, something that bends the rules of architecture and physics. The roses watch me now. I can feel their painted eyes following my movements, their thorns seeming to press against the inside of the wallpaper like trapped insects. The whisper has become a constant companion, counting down in my ear even when I'm not on the stairs, even when I'm trying to sleep. I've started leaving my apartment less frequently. The outside world feels thin and uncertain compared to the solid reality of the impossible staircase. At least here in this vertical maze, the rules are consistent in their inconsistency. The roses bloom and decay in their endless cycle. The steps multiply and divide according to logic I'm beginning to understand. Sometimes I catch glimpses of others like me, residents who have noticed the changes, who have been caught in the same loop. They climb past me with hollow eyes, their hands leaving burn marks on the banister, their lips moving in silent counts. We don't speak to each other. We're all counting different numbers, all climbing toward different destinations. The building is growing taller. I can feel it stretching upward, adding floors that don't exist, creating space where none should be. My apartment is no longer on the 4th floor. It's on the 7th or the 15th or the 23rd. The number changes, but the location remains the same. I'm always exactly where I need to be to hear the whisper, to smell the roses, to feel the burn of the banister against my palm. I've stopped trying to leave. The stairs have become my world, and my world has become the stairs. Every climb is a journey through impossible geometry, every descent a return to questions that have no answers. The roses count with me now, their whispers synchronizing with my heartbeat. Up, down, always different, always the same. The staircase changed length, and in changing, it changed me. I am part of its architecture now, another element in its endless, impossible equation. Another voice in its chorus of counters, another hand leaving burns on its banister. Another soul climbing toward a destination that exists only in the space between steps, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence between numbers. The count continues, it will always continue, and I will always be here, climbing, descending, measuring the immeasurable distance between floors that shift like dreams and steps that multiply like fears. The roses know the true number. They've been counting far longer than I have, and they will count long after I've become another whisper in the walls. Story 10, the chime rang at random, no one outside, no camera triggered. I traced the wiring, it wasn't connected to anything, just a hollow shell mounted to the wall. Still, the bell kept ringing, always when I was alone, always followed by the scent of tobacco smoke I couldn't trace. I tried to ignore it. Then came the note under the door, you heard me, open it. The first thing I noticed was how the sound seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, not from the brass fixture hanging beside my front door. A deep, resonant chime that made my teeth ache slightly, like standing too close to church bells. I'd lived in this house for 3 years, and the doorbell had never worked. The previous owner mentioned it during the walkthrough, apologizing for the broken fixture with a nervous laugh that seemed oddly forced. I pulled out my phone and started recording whenever the chime sounded. The audio files showed nothing but ambient noise, the hum of the refrigerator, distant traffic, my own breathing. Yet I could swear I heard that bell, clear as morning frost on glass. The tobacco smell always followed within seconds, sweet and acrid, like someone had just extinguished a pipe in my living room. I began keeping a notebook, documenting each occurrence. The pattern emerged slowly. The chime only rang when I was completely alone, never when friends visited or delivery drivers approached. It happened most frequently during the quiet hours between afternoon and evening, when shadows began to stretch across the hardwood floors. The smell would linger for exactly the same duration each time, long enough for me to walk through every room searching for its source, but never long enough to pinpoint its origin. The note appeared on a Tuesday. I found it when I returned from work, a small piece of yellowed paper that had been slipped under the door. The handwriting was precise, almost calligraphic, written in what looked like fountain pen ink. The paper felt wrong between my fingers, too smooth, too cold, as if it had been stored somewhere damp and dark for decades. I tried removing the doorbell entirely. The brass fixture came away easily, revealing nothing but a small hole in the wall where the mounting screws had been. But the chiming continued, seemingly emanating from that empty space. I sealed the hole with wood filler and painted over it, but the sound persisted, now muffled but somehow more insistent. The recordings became my obsession. I set up multiple devices around the house, hoping to capture something, anything that would validate what I was experiencing. The microphones picked up everything else, the settling of the house, the whisper of wind through the eaves, even the soft footsteps of my upstairs neighbor, but never the chime. I started staying awake later, watching the door, waiting. The house felt different during these vigils. The familiar creaks and sighs took on an expectant quality, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The walls seemed to pulse slightly when I pressed my palms against them, a rhythm just slightly off from my own heartbeat. The tobacco smell grew stronger. What had been a faint trace became a presence, thick enough to make my eyes water. I could almost taste it, that sweet burn of aged leaf and ember. I searched every inch of the house, checking for hidden ashtrays, looking for any explanation. Nothing. The smell would fade just as I convinced myself I was imagining it, only to return more potent than before. More notes appeared, short messages on the same yellowed paper, always slipped under the door while I was away. You're listening now. The door remembers. Some thresholds never close. Each one felt colder than the last, and I began to notice that my fingertips would go numb after handling them. I installed a security camera pointing directly at the door, determined to catch whoever was leaving these messages. The footage showed nothing, just the empty hallway outside my apartment, the door remaining closed and undisturbed. Yet when I returned home, there would be another note waiting. The chiming changed. Instead of the single, clear tone, it became a sequence. 3 short chimes, then 2 long ones, then a pause, over and over like someone tapping out a code. I found myself unconsciously counting along, my fingers drumming the rhythm on tables, my foot tapping it out while I walked. I researched the house's history, diving into property records and old newspaper archives. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s, converted to apartments decades later. Nothing unusual in the official records, but I found mention of a previous tenant who had complained about disturbances before moving out suddenly. The complaints were vague, filed with the building management, but never investigated. The doorbell fixture reappeared. I came home to find it mounted exactly where it had been before, the brass polished to a mirror shine. The mounting screws were tight, as if they had never been removed, but there were still no wires, no connection to any electrical system, just the hollow shell, somehow more present than before. I touched it once just to confirm it was real. The metal was warm, almost feverish, and for a moment I could swear I felt a vibration running through it, like a tuning fork struck in some distant room. The sensation traveled up my arm, settling in my chest like a second heartbeat. That night the chiming became constant, not the rhythmic pattern, but a continuous, overlapping series of tones that seemed to come from every direction at once. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't coming through my ears anymore. It was inside my head, reverberating through my skull like I was trapped inside a bell tower. I ran to the door, grabbed the brass fixture, and yanked it from the wall. It came away easily, taking chunks of plaster with it, but the chiming continued, louder now, more insistent. I threw the fixture across the room, watching it hit the wall and clatter to the floor. The sound never stopped. Standing there in my living room, surrounded by the relentless chiming that no recording device could capture, I finally understood. The doorbell wasn't broken. It was working perfectly. It had always been working. It just wasn't ringing for visitors from outside. I picked up the fixture from where it had fallen. The brass was cold now, cold enough to burn, but I held it anyway, feeling that strange vibration travel through my bones. The chiming stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. The next morning I found a final note under the door. Just 2 words this time: well done. I still live in the house. The doorbell hangs on the wall, polished and silent. I've stopped trying to explain what happened, stopped keeping recordings or notes. But sometimes, in the quiet hours between afternoon and evening, I catch the faint scent of tobacco smoke. And I find myself standing by the door, my hand hovering over the brass fixture, wondering what would happen if I pressed it. The chiming hasn't returned, but I know it's waiting. Some doors, once opened, never really close. Some thresholds exist whether we acknowledge them or not, and sometimes the thing on the other side just wants to be heard. I keep my hand away from the doorbell, but the temptation grows stronger each day. And I'm beginning to understand that eventually, curiosity becomes compulsion, and compulsion becomes inevitability. The brass feels warm when I walk past it now, almost welcoming, almost ready. Story 11, at first it was faint, barely audible under the sound of the shower or fan. A whisper repeating things I thought I'd forgot, phrases I'd said in anger, regrets I never told anyone. The voice got louder over time, closer. One night it said something I never said aloud to anyone, something I hadn't even admitted to myself, something I was sure only one other person knew, and they were long gone. The first instance happened while I was washing dishes. Steam rose from the sink, fogging the window above it, and through the rhythmic splash of water against ceramic, I heard it, a murmur so soft it might have been my imagination. Words I recognized but couldn't quite place. My hands stilled in the soapy water, listening. The voice faded into the drone of the refrigerator, leaving only the metallic taste of unease on my tongue. I dismissed it as stress. Work had been demanding, sleep elusive. The mind plays tricks when stretched thin, but the voice returned the next evening, threading through the hum of the television. This time clearer, it spoke of the argument I'd had with my neighbor about the fence, repeating my exact words back to me with unsettling precision. Words I'd spoken in frustration, alone in my kitchen, to no one but the empty air. I muted the television, heart hammering against my ribs. Silence filled the room like thick honey, pressing against my eardrums. I waited, counting my breaths, but heard nothing more. The floorboards beneath my feet felt different somehow, warmer, as if something had been standing there moments before. Sleep became a stranger. I found myself lying awake, cataloging every sound the house made. The settling of wood, the whisper of fabric against skin, the distant hum of electrical currents running through the walls. Within these familiar sounds, I began to detect patterns, repetitions. The voice was there, woven into the background noise like a hidden frequency only I could tune into. I started keeping a journal, documenting each occurrence. The voice spoke of childhood embarrassments, of lies I'd told my parents, of the crush I'd harbored for a coworker but never acted upon. Each revelation felt like a violation, as if invisible fingers were rifling through the most private corners of my memory. The entries grew longer, more detailed, as the voice became bolder. The breakthrough came during a particularly quiet afternoon. I was reading when the central heating clicked on, and through the gentle rush of warm air through the vents, I heard it clearly. The voice was talking about the summer I'd spent helping my grandmother move from her old house. It described the afternoon I'd found her hidden savings, rolled tight in an old coffee can behind her winter coats. Money she'd saved for decades, forgotten by everyone else, including herself. I'd never told anyone about that money, not my parents, not my siblings. I'd quietly slipped it into her purse later that same day, watching her face light up when she discovered it, convinced she'd simply misplaced it. The secret had felt good to keep, a small kindness that needed no witness. But the voice knew. It described the exact amount, the way the bills smelled of lavender and dust, the guilt I'd felt for even considering keeping it. Details no one else could possibly know. My hands trembled as I closed the book. The voice continued speaking, now describing the hospital visits that followed, the way the afternoon light slanted through the windows of her room, the exact words she'd whispered during our last conversation. Words I'd never repeated to anyone, not even in my own journal. I began recording everything. My phone captured hours of ambient house sounds, the refrigerator cycling, the heating system breathing, the subtle creaks of an old foundation. During playback, I could hear my own voice clearly, but the other voice remained elusive, slipping between frequencies like smoke. Yet in real time, it was undeniable. The voice grew more intimate, more invasive. It spoke of my deepest shames, my secret jealousies, my private fears. It knew about the letters I'd written but never sent, the apologies I'd rehearsed but never delivered. It recounted conversations I'd had with myself in the mirror, complete with the exact expressions I'd worn, the way I'd tilted my head when wrestling with particularly difficult emotions. I stopped eating regularly. Food tasted like ash, and my appetite disappeared under the weight of constant observation. The voice was no longer confined to specific rooms or appliances. It emerged from air vents, from the walls themselves, from the spaces between floorboards. My home had become a confessional where I was both priest and penitent, but the voice was the true authority. The breaking point arrived during a storm. Rain hammered against the windows with unusual intensity, and the power flickered repeatedly. In the unstable light, shadows seemed to shift independently of their sources. I sat in my living room, surrounded by my recordings and journal entries, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. The voice spoke then with perfect clarity, no longer hidden within other sounds. It told me about the night I'd driven home from the graduation party, the one where I'd had too much to drink but convinced myself I was fine. It described the intersection where I'd run the red light, the family crossing the street, the split-second decision I'd made to swerve. The voice knew about the father I'd nearly hit, about the way he'd grabbed his child and stumbled backward, about the look of terror in his eyes. It knew about the sleepless nights that followed, about the newspaper I'd scoured for weeks afterward, searching for any mention of an accident that never happened. Most importantly, it knew about the promise I'd made to myself that night, that I would never drink and drive again, that I would carry the weight of what almost happened as a reminder of who I could become in a moment of weakness. The voice knew because it had been there in the passenger seat, whispering encouragement to drive faster, to take the shortcut, to make it home before anyone noticed I was gone. It had been there all along, not as an external presence, but as the part of me I'd spent years trying to forget. I stood up, legs unsteady, and walked to the bathroom. In the mirror, my reflection looked hollow, aged beyond my years. The voice continued speaking, now describing this very moment, the way the light caught the dark circles under my eyes, the tremble in my hands as I gripped the sink. I smashed the mirror with my fist, watching the glass fracture into 1,000 reflecting fragments. Each piece showed a different angle of my face, a different expression of the fear I'd been carrying. The voice didn't stop. It laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and told me about the satisfaction I'd felt when my knuckles split open, about the way the pain felt like punishment and relief all at once. The storm passed, but the voice remained. It had evolved beyond whispers in the walls. Now it spoke directly into my ear, a constant companion sharing observations about my every action, my every thought. It knew what I was going to say before I said it, what I was going to do before I did it. I tried leaving the house, but the voice traveled with me. It commented on the people I passed, revealing their secrets too, their hidden shames and private fears. It described the cashier's struggle with addiction, the neighbor's affair, the stranger's deepest regret. The world became a gallery of exposed vulnerabilities, and I was the unwilling curator. When I returned home, the walls felt different, warmer, more alive. The voice was no longer coming from the house, it was coming from me. I was the house, and the house was me, and we were both vessels for everything I'd ever tried to forget. I sit here now, writing in my journal, feeling the voice moving through me like blood through veins. It's explaining to me how I'll finish this entry, how I'll close the book, how I'll continue living with the weight of omniscience I never wanted. It tells me about the dreams I'll have tonight, about the conversations I'll have with myself tomorrow, about the secrets I'll discover in the years to come. The voice knows everything because it is everything, every suppressed memory, every buried guilt, every hidden truth I've carried. It's the price of consciousness, the cost of being alive and aware and human. We all carry voices like this, but most people are lucky enough never to hear them clearly. I'm not one of those people anymore. The voice is part of me now, and I am part of it, and together we know far more than any single person was ever meant to know. The secret I thought only one other person knew was wrong. The voice knew it too. The voice has always known. And now it's teaching me to listen to other voices in other houses, carrying other secrets. The conversation is just beginning. Story 12, I'd never been up there, didn't even know there was a hatch until I moved the lamp. Curiosity pushed me to open it. A ladder led up into dusty blackness. I climbed, but the space stretched too far. It wasn't an attic. It was a tunnel, long, narrow, filled with old furniture and boxes that weren't mine. I followed it for what felt like miles, deeper and deeper. Then I found another hatch. It led to my own living room. The wood creaked beneath my weight as I descended back into familiar territory. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, the same crooked picture frame, the same coffee mug sitting on the end table, still warm, but something had shifted. The air carried a faint metallic taste like pennies left in summer rain. I touched the hatch above me and it felt different, warmer, almost alive under my fingertips. That night I heard footsteps, not the settling of old floorboards, but deliberate steps moving back and forth across the ceiling. The same rhythm I'd used when walking through that impossible space. I pressed my ear against the wall and the vibrations traveled through the plaster like a heartbeat. When I pulled away, dust had collected on my cheek, dust that smelled of places I'd never been. I started documenting everything. Took photographs of the hatch, measured the dimensions of my living room, recorded the sounds at different periods during the day. The footsteps followed a pattern. They started soft, barely audible, then grew more insistent as if someone was learning to walk properly. Sometimes I'd catch whispers threading through the heating vents, words I couldn't quite make out, but that felt familiar, like conversations I'd had with myself. The photographs developed strangely. In every shot of the hatch, there was a second opening visible in the background, one that didn't exist when I took the picture. The opening appeared to lead to another room, one with furniture I recognized but couldn't place. Old chairs from childhood, a desk I'd seen in dreams, books whose spines were too blurred to read. I climbed back up. The tunnel had changed. New pathways branched off in directions that defied the layout of my house. I followed one and found myself in a room that mirrored my bedroom perfectly, except the bed was made with sheets I'd thrown away years ago. The closet door stood ajar, revealing clothes that belonged to someone else, someone who shared my exact measurements. I touched the fabric, and it was still warm from a body that had just left it. The mirror on the dresser reflected the room correctly, but I wasn't in it, just empty space where I should have been standing. I waved my hand, and nothing moved in the reflection. But when I stepped away, I saw a figure in the mirror continue to stand where I'd been, wearing my face but moving with different intentions. The whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, describing actions I was about to take before I took them. They told me I would touch the doorknob next, and my hand moved toward it against my will. They said I would look under the bed, and I found myself nailing, peering into darkness that stretched much further than the space should have allowed. Under the bed, I found my journal, the one I'd started keeping to document these experiences. But the handwriting was different, neater, more deliberate, and it contained entries I hadn't written yet. Tomorrow's observations, next week's discoveries, descriptions of rooms I hadn't found yet but would soon explore. According to the journal, I would become lost in this space. I would wander through infinite versions of my own home, each one slightly different, each one teaching me new truths about what I thought I knew. The journal described my growing realization that the house below, the one I'd been living in, was just another room in this vast network of spaces that existed in the gaps between what should be possible. I tried to leave, retraced my steps through the tunnel, but the hatch that led to my living room was gone. Instead, I found dozens of other openings, each one leading to a different version of the same rooms. In one, my kitchen table was set for dinner with someone I'd never met. In another, my bathroom mirror showed a face that looked like mine but older, scarred by experiences I hadn't lived yet. The whispers explained that I'd been climbing up and down through these spaces for much longer than I realized. That what I thought was my first discovery of the hatch was actually the 100th or 1000th. That I'd been documenting and forgetting, exploring and returning, losing and finding myself in an endless cycle of discovery. I found rooms full of my belongings from different periods of my life. Childhood toys arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. High school notebooks filled with homework assignments I'd never received. College textbooks for classes that didn't exist at any university I'd attended. Each object was exactly as I remembered it, but infused with a significance I couldn't grasp. In one room, I found a chair facing a window that looked out onto my own backyard, but the view was wrong. The garden was overgrown with plants I'd never planted, and there was someone sitting in my usual spot on the porch. Someone who looked like me, but moved with the slow, deliberate motions of someone who had learned to be patient, someone who had learned to wait. The temperature in each room fluctuated without reason. Some spaces felt like summer afternoons, others like winter mornings. The changes followed no pattern I could understand, but they seemed to respond to my emotional state. Fear made the air cold, curiosity warmed it, desperation made it thin and hard to breathe. I started leaving myself notes, scratching words into the walls with my keys. Messages to remember, warnings to be careful, directions to help me find my way back. But when I returned to the same rooms later, the messages were different. Someone had been editing them, changing their meaning, adding words that shifted the entire context of my warnings. The handwriting looked like mine, but I couldn't remember making those changes. I found a room where every surface was covered in photographs of me. Not pictures I'd taken or posed for, but candid shots of me sleeping, eating, walking through my house. Pictures of me discovering the hatch for the first time, looking surprised and curious. Pictures of me writing in my journal, taking measurements, recording sounds. Pictures of me reading these same pictures, my expression growing more disturbed with each image. The photographs were organized chronologically, but the chronology was wrong. Pictures of me as a child were mixed with pictures of me as an adult, but the adult me was wearing clothes from childhood, playing with toys that had been lost for decades. The timeline suggested I'd been living in this space much longer than I'd been alive. The whispers started calling my name, not the name I'd grown up with, but names I'd never heard before. They spoke with voices that sounded like mine but carried different accents, different inflections. They told me stories about the other versions of myself that had found this place, about the ones who had tried to leave and the ones who had decided to stay. They told me I was the one who had been leaving the footprints above my living room ceiling, that I'd been walking back and forth, trying to remember how to exist in the space below, practicing the movements of someone who lived a normal life in a normal house with normal limitations. I found the room where I'd been sleeping, a bed I didn't recognize, but the sheets smelled like my dreams. The pillow held the exact impression of my head, though I couldn't remember ever lying there. Next to the bed was a journal, not the one I'd been keeping, but one that had been kept about me. Observations written in my handwriting, describing my habits, my fears, my patterns of behavior. The journal noted that I became most active during certain periods, that I would emerge from this space and spend time in the house below, convincing myself it was real. It described how I would always eventually find the hatch again, how curiosity would always win over caution, how I would always climb back up into this place and rediscover what I'd been trying to forget. According to the journal, I'd been writing and rewriting my own story for longer than I could comprehend. Each time I thought I was discovering something new, I was actually following a script I'd written for myself, performing the role of someone who was surprised by what they found. The last entry was dated tomorrow. It described how I would finally understand that there was no way back to the house below, that it had been just another room in this infinite space all along. It described how I would accept this truth and begin the process of becoming someone who could exist here permanently. It described how I would start preparing the space for the next version of myself to discover. I'm writing this now from a room that looks exactly like my study, but the books on the shelves are all blank. The window shows the same view I've always known, but the light never changes. The clock on the wall has no hands, just a face that watches me write. I can hear someone moving around in the house below, someone who thinks they live there, who believes in the solidity of walls and the limitations of space. Someone who will eventually move a lamp and discover something that shouldn't exist. I'm leaving this account where they'll find it, though I know they'll think it's fiction. They'll read it as a story someone else wrote, not recognizing their own thoughts, their own fears, their own inevitable path back to this place. The whispers are getting louder. They're telling me it's time to take my position by the window, to become the figure watching from the porch. They're explaining that this is how it's always been, how it will always be, how the space maintains itself through the endless circulation of discovery and acceptance. I can feel myself becoming more patient, more willing to wait, more understanding of the necessity of this cycle. The footsteps above are getting quieter. Someone is learning to walk more carefully, to move with the deliberate grace of someone who has learned to exist in impossible spaces. Soon I'll hear them climbing back down, returning to the house below with the absolute certainty that they've escaped something terrible. They'll try to forget what they've seen, to convince themselves it was a dream or a trick of tired eyes. But they'll remember the warmth of the hatch under their fingertips. They'll remember the taste of metallic air and the sound of their own footsteps echoing in spaces that shouldn't exist. And eventually, curiosity will win again. I'm still here, I'm still waiting. I'm still learning to be patient in the spaces between what should be possible. The hatch is always there, just waiting to be found. Story 13, it started as gurgling, normal at first, then louder, rhythmic, almost like syllables. The water ran clear, but something beneath the drain hissed like steam escaping. I pressed my ear to the porcelain. The bubbling stopped. Then a voice whispered from inside the pipes, not speaking, but mimicking my own voice, not in echo, in mockery. I turned off the faucet and stepped back. The kitchen felt different now, as if the walls had shifted slightly while I wasn't looking. The fluorescent light above buzzed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I touched the sink's edge. Still warm from the hot water, but the warmth pulsed like a heartbeat beneath my fingertips. The first recording captured nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing, but when I played it back, there was something else. A whisper buried beneath the static, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. I rewound it, turned up the volume. The whisper grew clearer, but the words became more foreign, as if the language itself was dissolving. I started keeping a journal, every sound, every anomaly, every moment when the house felt wrong. The entries began short and factual. By the fourth page, my handwriting had changed. The letters slanted differently, as if someone else was guiding my pen. I didn't notice until I compared the pages side by side. The smell came next, sweet, like overripe fruit, but with an undertone of copper. It wafted up from the drain whenever I approached the sink. I poured bleach down the pipes, called a plumber. He found nothing wrong. After he left, the smell intensified. It followed me through the house, clinging to my clothes, my hair, my skin. Showers couldn't wash it away. The reflection in the kitchen window started showing things that weren't there. A figure standing behind me when I was alone. Trees moving in wind that didn't exist. The figure grew more distinct each night until I could see its face. It was mine, but wrong. The eyes too wide, the mouth stretched in a smile that never reached the surface. I covered all the mirrors, turned off the lights, but the reflections found other surfaces. The microwave door, the chrome on the faucet, the blade of a knife. My wrong face stared back from everything metal, everything glass, everything that could hold an image. The phone started ringing with no one on the line, but if I listened carefully, I could hear breathing. My own breathing, recorded from earlier calls, played back at the wrong speed. Sometimes it was faster, frantic, sometimes slower, as if I were dying. The breathing never matched what I was doing in the moment. I tried to leave, packed a bag, walked to the front door. My hand touched the knob and the entire house shuddered. The lights flickered and every faucet in the building turned on at once. Water rushed through the pipes with such force that the walls vibrated. I could hear my voice echoing from every drain, every toilet, every sink, saying words I'd never spoken. The recording equipment multiplied the voices. Dozens of versions of myself, all speaking different words, all overlapping until the sound became a roar. I unplugged everything, but the voices continued. They came from the walls now, from the floorboards, from the air itself. I wrote everything down, but the words kept changing on the page. Sentences rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. My handwriting became someone else's, then changed again. The journal filled with entries I didn't remember writing, describing things I'd never done, conversations I'd never had. The figure in the reflection stepped closer, not closer to the surface, but closer to me. It moved through the house independently, appearing in windows I wasn't near, mirrors I'd covered. I could track its movement by the cold spots it left behind. The temperature dropped wherever it had been, and the air tasted of metal and decay. I sealed the drains with tape, but the voices found other ways out. They whispered from electrical outlets, hummed through the heating vents, buzzed through the light fixtures. The house became a speaker, and I was the sound it broadcast. The final recording captured everything. My voice, but not my words, speaking in languages I didn't know, singing songs I'd never heard, confessing to crimes I'd never committed. The voice was mine, but the thoughts behind it belonged to someone else. Someone who had been waiting in the pipes, in the walls, in the space between what I saw and what was real. I tried to destroy the tapes, but they regenerated. Blank cassettes filled themselves with my voice. New recordings appeared on devices I'd never owned. The sound of myself became inescapable, a constant reminder that I was no longer alone in my own skin. The house still stands, the pipes still gurgle, the sink still speaks in bubbles, but now I understand the language. Now I know what it's been trying to tell me. The voice in the pipes was never separate from me. It was the part of myself I'd been drowning, the thoughts I'd been washing away, the words I'd been swallowing. I still live here, still brush my teeth at the sink that knows my secrets, still shower in water that whispers back my fears. The recording equipment sits silent now, but I don't need it anymore. I can hear everything clearly. Every voice is mine. Every whisper is a conversation I'm having with myself. The reflection in the window waves at me now. I wave back. We understand each other perfectly. The house breathes with my rhythm. The pipes sing with my voice. The drains swallow everything I don't want to remember, then feed it back to me in bubbles and steam, and the sound of water finding its way through darkness. I am the voice in the pipes. I am the figure in the reflection. I am the sound the house makes when it dreams. And in the morning, when the sun rises and the water runs clear, I'll still be here, listening to myself whisper secrets I don't remember telling. Story 14, I never saw it happen, but things shifted. The chair was closer to the table. The rug was slightly off-center. I marked everything with chalk. The next day, every mark was still there, moved perfectly with the furniture. I installed a camera. Nothing moved, but when I paused the footage and zoomed in, I saw it. A blurred shape crouched behind the couch, watching, waiting. The first sign was the coffee mug. I had placed it on the kitchen counter before taking a shower, exactly 3 inches from the edge next to the sugar bowl. When I returned, steam still rising from my skin, the mug sat 2 inches closer to the sink. The sugar bowl remained untouched. I stared at the ceramic surface, feeling the cool morning air brush against my damp shoulders, and tried to remember if I had moved it myself. But I knew I hadn't. The apartment smelled different too, not wrong exactly, just shifted. The usual blend of old wood and cleaning products had been joined by something else, something that reminded me of rain on hot pavement, though it hadn't rained in weeks. I pressed my palm against the counter where the mug had been. The surface felt warm, warmer than it should have been in the morning chill. I began to document everything. A notebook appeared on my nightstand, black leather, pages filled with my own handwriting that I couldn't remember creating. Lists of objects, their positions, tiny measurements in the margins, the dining room table, 14 inches from the wall, the bookshelf perfectly aligned with the window frame, the mirror in the hallway, reflecting the lamp from an angle that seemed wrong, as if the light was coming from somewhere else entirely. Each morning brought new discoveries. The armchair had rotated 5 degrees clockwise. The painting above the fireplace hung slightly askew, though the nail remained centered. My reflection in the bathroom mirror appeared a fraction of a second after I looked into it, as if the glass needed a moment to catch up with reality. I started leaving markers, coins on tables, books balanced on chair arms, strips of tape on the floor. Every marker moved with its corresponding object, maintaining perfect relationships that defied explanation. The chair shifted 3 inches to the left, and so did the coin on its seat. The coffee table slid toward the window, carrying with it the magazine I had positioned precisely in its center. The sounds began on a Tuesday, soft scratching inside the walls like fingernails against wood. I pressed my ear to the plaster and felt vibrations that seemed to respond to my touch, growing stronger when I held my breath, fainter when I pulled away. The scratching formed patterns, 3 short, 2 long, 1 extended scrape that made my teeth ache. I installed cameras in every room, motion sensors in the corners, recording devices that captured frequencies beyond human hearing. The footage showed nothing. Empty rooms, furniture in their designated positions, shadows falling exactly where they should. But in the recordings, I heard whispers threaded through the static, not words exactly, but something that sounded like conversation, like someone explaining something very important in a language I almost understood. Frame by frame, I examined every second of footage. Most showed nothing unusual, but in some frames, if I zoomed in far enough, I could see distortions. Spaces where the light bent wrong, areas where the wallpaper pattern didn't quite match between one frame and the next. And in one clip lasting exactly 3 frames, I saw it clearly. A figure hunched behind the sofa, its outline blurred as if it were moving impossibly fast while everything else remained still. The temperature in the apartment began to fluctuate, not dramatically, just enough to notice. The bathroom would be warm while the bedroom felt cool, even though both thermostats read the same. Sometimes I would walk from one room to another and feel the air pressure change, as if I were moving between different altitudes. My ears would pop, and for a moment, all sounds would seem to come from very far away. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. The bed was moving, not dramatically, but consistently. Each morning, it sat an inch closer to the window. The pillows rearranged themselves in configurations I had never created. The sheets pulled tighter than I remembered making them, tucked with hospital corners I had never learned to fold. Instead, I slept on the living room couch, surrounded by my cameras and notebooks. I learned to sleep with one eye open, to wake at the slightest sound, but the apartment had grown quieter. The scratching in the walls had stopped. The whispers in the recordings faded to nothing. Even the furniture seemed to have settled into new positions, as if reaching some kind of equilibrium. That was when I realized the truth. The apartment wasn't changing around me. I was changing around it. The measurements in my notebook weren't documentation of movement, they were instructions. The chalk marks weren't tracking displacement, they were guiding it. Every attempt to capture the phenomenon had been an invitation, a way of teaching it how to be more precise, more deliberate. I tried to leave. The front door opened easily, but the hallway beyond looked wrong. The same carpet, the same lighting, but the distance to the elevator seemed to stretch further than it should. I walked for what felt like hours, but the door to my apartment remained visible behind me, growing neither closer nor farther away. Eventually, I turned around and walked back, feeling the familiar warmth of my own air conditioning wash over me. The apartment welcomed me home with subtle changes. The furniture had shifted again, but this time into arrangements that felt more comfortable, more suited to my daily routines. The couch faced the window at a better angle for reading. The kitchen table sat positioned perfectly for morning coffee. The mirror in the hallway reflected my image clearly, without the strange delay. I still document everything. The notebook continues to fill with my handwriting, though I don't remember writing most of it. The measurements are more precise now, calculated to fractions of inches. The cameras still record, but the footage has become more interesting. I can see myself in the recordings, moving through the apartment, rearranging furniture with careful precision, measuring distances with tools I don't remember owning. But I never see myself doing it, I only see the results. The blurred figure still appears in the recordings, but it's clearer now, more defined. It moves through the apartment with purpose, adjusting objects with careful attention to detail. Sometimes it pauses and looks directly at the camera, as if checking its work, as if seeking approval. I've learned to recognize its preferences. It likes symmetry but not perfection. It prefers angles that create pleasing sightlines. It has an excellent sense of proportion. We work well together, though I've never seen us in the same frame. The apartment feels more like home now than it ever did before. Everything sits exactly where it should be. The air smells right. The temperature remains constant. Even the sounds have improved. The scratching has evolved into something more musical, more rhythmic, like someone tapping out a complex melody on the bones of the building. I no longer try to leave. Why would I? This is where I belong. This is where everything makes sense. The furniture moves when I blink, and I blink when the furniture needs to move. We understand each other perfectly. The only thing that bothers me now is the growing certainty that I'm not the one documenting the changes. Someone else is filling my notebook. Someone else is reviewing the footage. Someone else is learning from the patterns we create together. But I never see them doing it. I only see the results. Story 15, even when unplugged, it emitted a low static hum. I opened it up, nothing abnormal, no current, no vibration. Still, the noise persisted. One night, the screen flickered. For a fraction of a second, an image appeared, something staring from inside the glass. The next day, my own reflection looked different, like it knew something I didn't. The television had been sitting in my living room for months, a relic from the previous tenant. Its wood-grain frame bore the scars of decades, and its screen held a permanent layer of dust that seemed to reappear no matter how often I cleaned it. The sound was barely audible during the day, lost beneath the ambient noise of traffic and neighbors. But in the deep silence of night, it became impossible to ignore. I pressed my ear against the plastic vents on the back panel. The hum was definitely coming from within, a constant electrical whisper that shouldn't exist. The power cord lay coiled on the floor, disconnected from any outlet. I'd checked every component twice, the capacitors, the circuit boards, the speakers. Everything appeared normal, inert, yet the sound continued, patient and persistent. The first time I heard voices threading through the static, I convinced myself it was interference from a nearby radio station. The words were too distorted to understand, like conversations heard through water. I began keeping a notebook beside the set, documenting the phenomena. The voices always came between midnight and dawn, never during daylight hours. They spoke in hushed tones, sometimes overlapping, sometimes singular and clear. I started recording these sessions with my phone, holding it close to the screen where the sound seemed most concentrated. When I played back the recordings, they contained only silence. The static that filled my apartment each night simply didn't exist in the digital files. This impossibility gnawed at me, transforming my casual curiosity into something more urgent. The screen began flickering more frequently. Never for long, just brief pulses of light that illuminated the dark room for a heartbeat. During these flashes, I caught glimpses of shapes moving within the glass. At first, I attributed them to reflections, perhaps shadows cast by passing cars outside. But the movements were too deliberate, too purposeful to be mere tricks of light. I rearranged the furniture, blocking any possible sources of reflection. I covered the windows with thick blankets, creating absolute darkness. Still, the shapes persisted. They moved with intention, as if aware of my presence. Sometimes they seemed to be reaching toward the surface of the screen, pressing against the glass from the inside. My sleep became fragmented. I would wake to find the static louder than before, more insistent. The voices had grown clearer too, though their words remained just beyond comprehension. They spoke in urgent whispers, as if trying to warn me of something approaching. I began sleeping in the living room, positioned where I could observe the television throughout the night. The breakthrough came during a particularly intense episode. The screen flickered longer than usual, and in that extended moment of illumination, I saw them clearly. Faces, human faces, but wrong somehow. Their features were familiar yet distorted, like photographs that had been stretched and compressed. They were trying to communicate, their mouths moving in silent desperation. I reached toward the screen, my fingertips making contact with the cool glass. The moment I touched it, the static stopped. Complete silence filled the room, more unsettling than any sound. The faces pressed closer to the inner surface, their eyes wide with what looked like terror or urgency. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, seemed to be mouthing the same word repeatedly. Run. The screen went dark, the silence stretched on, broken only by my own rapid breathing. I pulled my hand back, and immediately the static returned, louder and more aggressive than before. The voices came flooding back too, no longer whispers but urgent shouts that seemed to emanate from every direction at once. I unplugged every electronic device in the apartment, but the cacophony continued. The sound was no longer confined to the television. It poured from the walls, the ceiling, the floor itself. The faces had multiplied, appearing not just in the TV screen, but in every reflective surface, windows, mirrors, even the black screen of my phone. They were all reaching outward now, their hands pressed against the barriers that separated us. The woman with graying hair was still there, still mouthing her warning, but her expression had changed. The terror in her eyes was no longer for herself, but for me. She was trying to save me from something, but I couldn't understand what. I grabbed the notebook where I'd been documenting everything, intending to write down what I was seeing, but the pages were no longer blank. They were filled with my own handwriting, describing events I had no memory of recording. The entries detailed weeks of observation, conversations I'd never had, discoveries I'd never made. According to these notes, I'd been living with this phenomenon for much longer than I remembered. The most disturbing entry was dated for the following day. It described my disappearance, found written in my own careful script. The television would be found still humming, but I would be gone. The faces in the screen would be different then, including one that looked exactly like me. I ran to the bathroom, desperate to see my own reflection and confirm I was still myself. But the mirror showed me something else entirely. My face was there, but it was wrong. The features were stretched, compressed, just like the others. My mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear, my eyes filled with the same desperate terror I'd seen in the woman's face. I turned away from the mirror, but the image remained burned into my vision. When I looked back, my reflection was normal again, but now I could see additional figures standing behind me. They were all reaching forward, their hands pressing against the surface of the mirror from the inside. The static grew unbearable. I covered my ears, but the sound came from within my own head now. The voices were clearer than ever, and I finally understood what they were trying to tell me. They weren't warnings about something coming. They were pleas for help from something that had already happened. I returned to the television, knowing I had no choice. The screen was bright now, filled with movement and desperate faces. They were all like me, people who had tried to solve the mystery, who had gotten too close to something they couldn't understand. The woman with graying hair was still there, still trying to warn me, but now I could see the recognition in her eyes. She knew I was about to join them. The static reached a crescendo and then suddenly stopped. The screen went dark, the apartment filled with ordinary silence, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and the muffled sounds of traffic outside. Everything appeared normal, exactly as it had been before I'd noticed the first faint static. But I knew better now. I could feel them watching me from behind every dark surface, waiting for the next person to notice the sound. The notebook lay open on the coffee table, its pages blank once again. Soon, someone new would move into this apartment, and they would hear the static too. They would investigate, document, and reach toward the screen just as I had. The television sits silently in the corner, its screen dark and dusty. Sometimes, late at night, I can see my own face looking back from within the glass. I'm still trying to warn them, still mouthing the same word over and over. But like the woman with graying hair, I know they won't understand until it's too late. The sound will come again, it always does. Story 16, they moved freely, didn't match the light sources. Sometimes they appeared without anything casting them. One lingered by the window, shaped like a person hunched over. I touched the glass, no one there. Still, the shadow remained. The next morning, I found dirt on the sill and handprints on the inside. I've always been methodical. When something doesn't make sense, I document it. I started keeping a journal that morning, writing down everything I noticed about the shadows. Their positions, their movements, the way they seemed to respond to my presence. The leather-bound notebook became my anchor to rationality, each entry a small rebellion against the impossible. The first week I convinced myself it was stress. New apartment, new job, new city. The mind plays tricks when overwhelmed, but the shadows grew bolder. They appeared in daylight now, dark silhouettes against bright walls where no object stood to cast them. I photographed them, but the camera captured only empty spaces. Yet I could see them clearly, darker patches that seemed to breathe. The smell started during the second week, damp earth like freshly turned soil after rain. It followed the shadows, lingering in corners where they congregated. I checked for water damage, mold, any logical explanation. The apartment was dry. The scent intensified when I approached the shadows directly, as if they were marking territory. I began talking to them, quiet conversations in empty rooms, asking questions I never expected to voice. Who are you? What do you want? The shadows never answered, but they listened. I knew because they would shift slightly, turning toward my voice like flowers following sunlight. The comparison disturbed me. There was nothing natural about their attention. The temperature drops came next, pockets of cold that moved through the apartment independent of any draft. I'd walk into a room and find my breath misting in one corner while the rest remained warm. The shadows clustered in these cold spots, darker and more defined than elsewhere. I started wearing sweaters indoors, but the chill seemed to seep through fabric and skin, settling deep in my bones. I tried ignoring them, spent 3 days focusing solely on work, avoiding eye contact with the walls, keeping my gaze fixed on screens and books. But ignoring them felt like turning my back on a conversation mid-sentence. The silence grew heavy, expectant. On the 4th day, I found my journal open to a blank page. Someone had written in careful script, "We've been waiting." The handwriting was mine. I don't remember writing those words. I examined the ink, the pressure of the pen strokes, the slight tremor in my usually steady hand. Everything matched my writing perfectly, down to the way I dotted my I's. But the memory was absent, a black hole in my otherwise meticulous mental record-keeping. The shadows began moving differently after that. Instead of random drifts across walls and floors, they formed patterns. Circles within circles, spirals that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. I traced these patterns with my finger, following their logic, and felt the walls vibrate under my touch. Not the mechanical vibration of appliances or traffic, but something organic, like a heartbeat transmitted through plaster and wood. I started recording everything. Audio equipment borrowed from work, cameras set up in every room, motion sensors that beeped when something passed through their field of detection. The recordings showed nothing unusual, but the sensors triggered constantly. They tracked movement through empty spaces, following paths that coincided exactly with the shadows I could see. The breakthrough came during my third week of documentation. I was reviewing audio files when I heard it, a whisper buried in the static, so faint I almost missed it. I isolated the frequency, amplified it, played it back at different speeds. The whisper became a word, then a phrase, then a conversation. Multiple voices discussing me with clinical detachment, as if I were a specimen under observation. The subject is responding well to initial contact. Awareness levels are increasing according to schedule. Should we proceed to the next phase? The voices used my inflection, my speech patterns, my vocabulary, but they spoke about me as if I were separate from them, an experiment in progress. I played the recording dozens of times, searching for any explanation that didn't require accepting the impossible. The voices were definitely mine, but I had no memory of speaking those words. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. The shadows were too active there, too focused. I moved to the living room, but they followed. They filled the space around my makeshift bed, a crowd of dark watchers that never quite touched me but never left me alone. I could feel their attention like weight on my skin, pressing down until breathing became conscious effort. The journal entries multiplied. I found new pages filled with my handwriting, detailed observations I didn't remember making. The shadows were apparently documenting themselves through me, using my hand to record their activities. The entries described their movements from their perspective, written in first person as if I were one of them. Today I stretched across the ceiling, feeling the texture of paint beneath my non-substance. The host watched me but didn't understand. Understanding isn't necessary yet, only observation, only documentation, only the slow merging of realities. I tried throwing the journal away, but it reappeared on my desk. I burned it, but found a new one in my bag. The shadows were persistent, patient, methodical. They had adapted my own systematic approach to studying them, turning my tools against me. The final phase began when I stopped seeing my reflection properly. In mirrors, I cast a shadow that didn't match my position. When I raised my right hand, my shadow raised its left. When I stepped forward, it stepped back. We were moving in opposition, as if one of us was the other's negative image. But which one was real? I pressed my palm against the bathroom mirror, watching my reflection do the same. Our hands met on opposite sides of the glass, but my shadow remained motionless behind me. I could feel its presence, solid and patient, waiting for me to turn around. When I finally did, it was gone, but I was no longer alone in the reflection. The shadow me smiled while I frowned. It waved while I kept my hands at my sides. It mouthed words I couldn't hear, but I understood their meaning perfectly. It was explaining that we were switching places, that I would soon understand what it meant to exist without substance, to watch the world from the edges of vision, to document everything while being documented in return. I write this final entry as the transfer completes. My handwriting is becoming lighter, the pen harder to grip. The shadow me is growing more solid, more present, more real. Soon it will finish my documentation project, complete the study I began. It will live in my apartment, do my job, maintain my routines. And I will join the others, the watchers in the corners, the observers without substance. The shadows didn't belong to anything because they were the anything. They were us, the documented becoming the documenters, the studied becoming the scholars. We exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt, in the gap between what is seen and what is real. And now, as I fade into the periphery of vision, I understand that the study never ends. Someone new will move into this apartment, someone methodical and curious, someone who will notice when the shadows don't match the light sources. They will document us, photograph us, record our whispers, and eventually they will join us. The handprints on the inside of the window weren't from outside trying to get in. They were from inside trying to get out, but there is no outside anymore. There is only the eternal study, the endless documentation, the perpetual watching. And we are always watching. We are always documenting. We are always waiting for the next observer to complete the pattern. Story 17. It wasn't a dream. I was awake still, lying flat, eyes wide open, and I heard it low, guttural, not quite human. A voice calling up from underneath the mattress, pleading, cursing, laughing. It knew my name. I never said it out loud. I stayed frozen for hours. When I finally moved, the whisper stopped, but the bed was warm from underneath. The warmth lingered against my back like a fever breaking. I pressed my palm against the mattress, feeling the heat seep through the fabric. Cotton shouldn't hold warmth like that, not without a body beneath it, not without something breathing underneath. I rolled onto my side, ear pressed against the sheets. Silence, the kind that makes your eardrums ache. I counted my heartbeats until the rhythm became unbearable, then slipped out of bed. The floorboards felt cold against my bare feet, a sharp contrast to the heated mattress I'd abandoned. Crouching beside the bed frame, I peered into the darkness underneath. Nothing but dust motes dancing in the thin shaft of light from the hallway. The space was too narrow for anything larger than a cat to hide, yet the voice had been so clear, so close it might have been whispered directly into my ear. I grabbed my phone and activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadow, revealing wooden slats, a forgotten sock, and the metal bed frame bolts. Everything normal, everything expected. I swept the light from corner to corner, searching for something that shouldn't be there. That's when I noticed the scratches. Thin lines carved into the wooden floor, parallel grooves that ran from the center of the bed toward the wall. Fresh wood showed through the scratches, pale and raw against the darker finish. They hadn't been there before, I was certain. I ran my finger along one of the gouges. The wood was smooth, almost polished, as if something had been dragging back and forth across the same path repeatedly. The scratches converged at a point directly beneath where my pillow rested. Standing up made me dizzy. The room seemed to tilt slightly, walls breathing in and out with an imperceptible rhythm. I steadied myself against the dresser and stared at the bed. It looked different now, not the familiar piece of furniture I'd slept on for years, but something foreign occupying my space. The voice came again. This time it wasn't muffled by mattress and box spring. It rose from the floor itself, seeping through the scratched wood like water through cracked concrete. Not words I could understand, but sounds that formed meaning in my mind. It was calling me back. It wanted me to lie down again, to press my body against the warm mattress and listen. I backed toward the door, phone light still cutting through the darkness. The beam caught something I'd missed before, a small hole in the baseboard directly beneath the bed's center. Round and smooth, about the size of a quarter, too perfect to be natural damage. Nailing, I directed the light into the opening. The hole went deeper than the wall should allow, extending beyond where the neighboring room began. I could feel air moving through it, carrying an odor I couldn't identify, something organic and stale, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I pressed my ear to the hole. The voice was louder here, clearer. Not one voice, but many, overlapping and weaving together into a chorus that knew my name, my fears, my dreams. They spoke of the warm space beneath the bed, of the comfort waiting there, of how natural it would be to slip through the floor and join them. My phone died. Darkness rushed back into the room like a tide. I scrambled for the light switch, but my hand found only smooth wall where the switch should be. The room had changed. Walls that should have been 3 steps away felt distant now, unreachable. The bed loomed in the center of the space, its outline visible against a faint glow that seemed to emanate from beneath it. I felt along the wall, searching for the door I'd entered through. My fingers found only continuous surface, no frame, no handle, no way out. The room had sealed itself around me, trapping me with the warm bed and the voices that rose from underneath. The scratches in the floor were spreading. I could hear them forming, wood splintering and groaning as invisible claws carved new paths across the surface. The sound circled the room, moving closer to where I stood pressed against the wall. Soon, the entire floor would be covered in those smooth, polished grooves. The voices grew insistent. They promised answers if I would only lie down again. They spoke of the space beneath the bed, of the community waiting there, of how lonely it had been without me. They knew things about me that I'd never told anyone, childhood fears, secret shames, the dreams that woke me in the middle of the night. I found myself moving toward the bed. Not walking exactly, but sliding across the floor as if the scratches were guiding my feet. The warm glow from beneath the mattress grew brighter, more welcoming. The voices became clearer, more distinct. I could almost make out faces in the light, familiar features that I should recognize but couldn't quite place. I was at the edge of the bed now, looking down at the rumpled sheets that still held the impression of my body. The mattress pulsed gently, like a sleeping chest rising and falling. The voices urged me to lie down, to press my ear against the warm surface and listen to what they had to tell me. Instead, I gripped the bed frame and pulled. The entire structure shifted, sliding across the floor with surprising ease. The scratches had made the wood slick, almost frictionless. As the bed moved, the hole in the baseboard grew larger, expanding until it was wide enough for a person to crawl through. Light poured from the opening, not the warm glow I'd seen before, but harsh fluorescent brightness that hurt my eyes. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than their whispers. I could see into the space beyond the hole now, into what should have been the neighboring apartment, but was instead a vast underground chamber. The floor was covered in scratches just like mine, but these were older, deeper, worn smooth by countless bodies that had dragged themselves across the surface. Dozens of beds were arranged in neat rows, each one glowing with that same warm light, each one calling to someone above. I understood then what the voices wanted, what they'd always wanted. They weren't trying to bring me down to their level, they were trying to make me like them. To scratch and claw and whisper until someone else heard their call and came to investigate. I'm still in my room. The bed is back in its original position, the hole in the baseboard covered by a piece of furniture I don't remember moving. The scratches in the floor are gone, but I can feel them beneath the surface, ready to reappear when needed. The voices are quieter now, but they haven't stopped. They whisper to me about the others upstairs, about the neighbors who sleep above me, about how easy it would be to let them know what waits beneath their beds. They tell me about the scratches I could make, the warmth I could provide, the community I could build. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself pressing my ear to the floor and listening. The voices are right, it is lonely up here, and the warm space beneath the bed is always ready to welcome someone new. I haven't started scratching yet, but my fingernails are growing longer and the floor looks softer each day. The voices assure me that it won't hurt, that the others will understand, that everyone needs someone to call their name in the darkness. The bed is warm again tonight. I can feel it from across the room inviting me back, and somewhere above I think I hear footsteps. Someone pacing, unable to sleep, wondering about the sounds coming from below. Soon they'll come to investigate. Soon they'll hear their name being called. And when they do, I'll be ready to welcome them home. Story 18, just slightly, a few degrees, enough to catch something it shouldn't. I leveled it twice, secured it. The tilt came back, always at an angle where it pointed not at me, but behind me. One night I turned around, nothing there, but when I looked back in the mirror, I saw something slip out of frame. The hallway mirror had been a gift from my grandmother, heavy silver backing with an ornate brass frame that caught the light in unexpected ways. I'd hung it across from the living room entrance, positioned perfectly to reflect the evening light streaming through the windows. For weeks, it sat exactly where I'd placed it, a perfect complement to the narrow space. Then the tilting began. The first adjustment felt routine. Houses settle, screws loosen, gravity wins. I straightened it, tightened the mounting hardware, stepped back to admire the correction. The surface reflected my satisfied expression, the familiar contours of my space behind me, everything normal, everything right. By the next evening, the mirror had shifted again. The same subtle angle, the same deliberate tilt that cast its reflection toward the corner behind my shoulder rather than straight ahead. I measured this time, used a level, marked the wall with pencil dots to ensure perfect alignment. The mounting was solid, the wall firm, no reason for movement. Yet it moved. I started paying attention to the reflection itself, studying what the mirror chose to show when it tilted. The corner it favored held nothing remarkable, a coat rack, a small table where I dropped my keys, the edge of a bookshelf. Empty space, mostly shadow, familiar furniture. But the mirror seemed insistent about capturing that particular angle, as if the tilt served some purpose I couldn't understand. The temperature in the hallway began to fluctuate. Cool spots appeared without drafts, warm patches bloomed near the mirror's base. I pressed my palm against the glass and felt it pulse with an inconsistent heat, like touching skin with an irregular heartbeat. The wall behind it vibrated almost imperceptibly, a tremor so faint I questioned whether I'd imagined it. I documented everything, photographs of the mirror's position, measurements of its angle, notes about the temperature variations. The evidence felt important, though I couldn't explain why. Each morning I'd find the mirror tilted exactly as before, pointing toward that same corner, defying my repeated corrections. The reflections started changing in subtle ways, not dramatically, nothing that would seem impossible to an observer, but enough to make me doubt my perception. The coat rack appeared closer than it should, the shadows seemed deeper, the proportions felt wrong. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in the peripheral edges of the reflection, quick shifts that vanished when I focused directly on them. I began standing in different positions, trying to understand what the mirror wanted to show me. From certain angles, the reflection revealed parts of my living space I'd never noticed before, a water stain on the ceiling, a scratch on the wall, the dust patterns beneath furniture. The mirror became a catalog of hidden details, imperfections made visible through its deliberate misdirection. The sounds started as whispers in my electronics. Static in my radio that formed almost words, distortion in my phone calls that resembled distant conversations. I recorded hours of these anomalies, played them back at different speeds, filtered out background noise. Sometimes the patterns seemed meaningful, like fragments of dialogue from a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My sleep became restless. I'd wake to find myself standing in the hallway, staring at the mirror in the dim light that filtered through the windows. The reflection showed me in these moments, but with subtle differences, my posture slightly altered, my expression not quite matching what I felt on my face. I'd return to bed wondering if the mirror showed the truth while I lived something else. The tilt grew more pronounced. Each adjustment I made seemed to provoke a stronger response, as if the mirror were becoming impatient with my interference. I stopped trying to correct it, curious to see how far the angle would progress. Within days, the mirror hung at such an extreme tilt that it reflected mostly the ceiling and the upper corners of the room. That's when I saw it clearly. The reflection showed something that shouldn't exist, a doorway in the corner where my wall met the ceiling, a passage that led somewhere impossible. The opening appeared solid in the mirror's surface, complete with depth and shadow, while the actual corner remained unchanged, just plaster and paint meeting at right angles. I climbed a ladder to examine the spot the mirror insisted contained a door. My hands found only smooth wall, no seams or irregularities. But when I looked down at the mirror from this height, the doorway in the reflection seemed to pulse with its own light, inviting and terrible. The final night, I woke to find the mirror completely vertical, its reflection pointing straight up toward the ceiling. The impossible doorway filled the entire surface, no longer a corner passage, but a wide opening that seemed to breathe with darkness. I could see movement within it, shapes that defied description pressing against the boundary between reflection and reality. I reached toward the mirror's surface, my fingertips barely grazing the glass. The moment of contact sent a shock through my body, not painful but transformative, as if something essential had been exchanged. The reflection rippled like water, and for an instant I saw myself from above, looking down at my own body reaching toward the mirror while something else reached back from within. The glass cracked then, a single line running from corner to corner, bisecting the impossible doorway. The reflection shattered into fragments, each piece showing a different version of my hallway, my corner, my life. Some fragments showed the space as it was, others revealed it as it could be, a few displayed it as it never should be. I swept up the pieces, wrapped them carefully, disposed of them far from my home. The wall now holds a different mirror, simple and functional, purchased new and hung level. It reflects only what stands before it, nothing more, nothing less. But sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I catch glimpses of those fragments reassembling themselves in the peripheral edges of my vision. The corner where the impossible doorway once appeared feels different now, charged with potential energy. The air there moves in ways that suggest passage, though passage to where, I no longer dare to investigate. The house still settles, screws still loosen, gravity still wins. But now I understand that some adjustments invite more than correction, they invite entry. And once entry is granted, the angle of perception changes forever, tilting toward truths that perhaps should remain reflected rather than revealed.